Hi, welcome to our symposium, Posthuman Art, Robots, Aliens, Chess, and Tokens. My name is Lisa Park SoYoung, and I will be introducing the symposium to you to begin with. And then, yeah, there's going to be a speech later to talk later too. So today for our symposium, we have media artist, theorist, and curator, Professor Maurice Benayoun, who is based in Hong Kong right now, who will also be giving us a keynote later on. And we also have Mr. Philosopher Dr. Martin E. Rosenberg joining us from US. Neuroscientist Professor Beatrice de Gelder joining us from the Netherlands. Curator-theorist Dr. Tanya Ravn Ag joining us from Denmark. Artist Dr. Ray LC, who is now with us in Hong Kong at the moment, and myself, artist scholar Lisa Park SoYoung, based in Hong Kong at the moment. And today we will also have a moderator, AI ethics and culture expert, Professor De Kai, who will be joining us shortly. And I will introduce everyone in more detail once we go into the program, but I will just introduce you the structure of our program. So we're going to have 1 hour of presentation first, and then we're going to have a 5-minute break. And then we're going to have another roughly 1 hour of presentation. And then we're going to have a discussion session and a Q&A. And that's going to end around 12 a.m. Hong Kong time. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Maurice Benayoun, Professor Maurice Benayoun. And in the meanwhile, Maurice can get ready. Yeah. So Maurice Benayoun is a media art pioneer, theorist, curator, and professor based in Hong Kong and Paris, whose accolades include the Ars Electronica Golden Nika, and the SIGGRAPH Art Award, among others, and traversing freely between media boundaries from virtual reality to large-scale public art installations, and from BCI to blockchain. Benayoun has exhibited across major international museums in about 30 countries. His recent research focuses on urban media art, critical fusion, behavioral design, the blockchain, transactional art, BCI-driven neurodesign, and the morphogenesis of human values. So please, Professor Benayoun, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for this kind of introduction. So I won't make a global introduction for the different talks, but I will give something generic enough, I guess, to make sense of all your talks and let you free to express yourself on your topics. So I have a very elaborate slides, and I would like to share them with you. So the question that I would like to address is posthuman art far too human? I guess this will be explicited more or less during my talk. So I would like to start with Montesquieu. In the Persian letters in the 18th century, he was asking, how can we be Persian? I think it's a really interesting question now. Because we understand that this question means, how can we be somebody else, a stranger, a foreigner, somebody with a totally different background? And how is it possible? And in the Persian letters, what happens is that these people coming from Persia are sending back to Persia different feedback about the Western culture. Trying to understand why people behave like that, what is the logic behind that, how it can be so different from what we know. And this is an amazing attempt to consider the world we live in from another remote point of view. And this is exactly what my talk is supposed to be about, and different topics that will be addressed by the other speakers. Wait a minute. Yeah, I was also thinking about the question of identity. What is it to be another? This is something we'll have to address when we think about the evolution of artworks nowadays. how they may become another self, another mind. So, je may be an artwork, or je est une œuvre d'art. So it's about individual alterities. It's kind of a schizophrenic, apparently, point of view to consider that we may have different point of view on the world. And you know that people are trying to express how to integrate cultures, how to integrate other species, and how to integrate the nature of I don't know, physical object, materiality, and so on, through what we call new materialism. All this is an attempt to consider that we are not at the center of the world, and we are not the only one. But at the same time, of course, we have to take into consideration the fact that we are the one asking the question, and we are the one trying to duplicate ourselves in a kind of a ubiquitous perspective, where we would see the world from different points, like, for example, Picasso was trying to represent the world from a different point, and Duchamp was trying to represent the world at different times in one image, and the futurist artist as well. So this is something that crossed the history of art during the last century and even more. And this is something that is more and more relevant, because if the question of who I am and how I can see the world from other point of view is important, it's also more important if the artwork itself is a way to extract ourselves from ourselves, and in a kind of cybernetic vision of the world, cyborgist, we could say that this extension of the body are actually offering other way to understand the world, and maybe to make visible some other aspect that seems to escape to people that too close from the subject. So the question is to decentralize a point of view, but not in a kind of politically correct way. It's not to say that we have to be others. It's to say we have to understand what it means to be others, which is different. Because there is no negation of the person. There is just a will to understand in a very inclusive way more people. So what is the world seen by a cultural, natural other? This is the most difficult thing to imagine, and I will show some examples that show and explain. No, don't never explain. An artwork doesn't explain anything. But they will try to address this question. What if our world would be seen by others? Something like we would be Persian or something else, or somebody else, or from somewhere else. And what would it mean? What would we understand and discover? So the point is, if we talk about others, we may address more specifically the question of the artificial other. The artificial other is the one we build when we make an artwork. When we make an interactive artwork with some functionalities that give it the possibility to be, to have some similarities with living beings, behaviors, and so on. And so, what does it mean? So a human-made apparatus, entity, with a design behavior may be this kind of artificial other. So if we look at art history, it's clear that until the middle of the 20th century, and even the end of the 20th century, and even the beginning of the 21st, for most people, art is about objects. So it's about things that we can hold, we can own, we can sell, we can buy, we can show. It's about object. So this is what I call the art object. But the mutation of this art object is that it is gradually becoming an art subject. So what does it mean that it becomes an art subject? First, it means that the artwork starts being conscious of its environment and of its public. So that's something important, of course, because if it's conscious of its public and its environment, what does it do with that? So consciousness is not something that is enough if you don't know what to do with it. So there is a big difference between a machine and an artwork. This difference, we know it, resides in the fact that the machine has functions and the artworks may have features. Of course, the ambiguity of the term may make us play with the metaphorical way, in a metaphorical way with these terms, but there is a big difference between something that is supposed to be useful in a practical way, the machine, and something that is supposed to convey complex, elaborated messages like an artwork. So it's about functionalities versus agencies. Here, I'm not talking about the art object, I'm talking about the art subject, which is supposed to do something that are actually very different of simple, compared to simple functionalities that would come from machine with a very precisely defined task. And the artwork would be more trying to express something and to enter in a form of interaction that would develop at a level of complexity of the human dialogue. So people talking together, people trying to exchange things with each other, people making love or making war are actually playing with this complexity of interrelations between people, and there are messages that are sent, including in war and love. So what is interesting is that the relation between the people and the public, between the user of the machine and the public, which is supposed to explore or understand the artwork, discover the artwork, is that there's either user or used versus others and strangers. So for the artwork, the others are, the public is made of strangers with a certain kind of familiarity, because the artwork has been designed for that. So the artwork is becoming an individual, and I know that Tanya will talk more about this question, but in a way they become semi-autonomous entities. And we have to be clear about what these entities are supposed to do. So this, of course, depends on what the artist does. The artist actually designed the behavior of the artwork. And this is a very strategical point, because instead of designing a final appearance, or aspect, instead of designing only colors and the composition, the artist is designing actions, intentions, and behaviors. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about trying to have machines that reach the level of complexity of the human mind Probably not yet, of course. But what does it mean talking about intelligence if you have no idea about what for? And so we should address the question of artificial intentionalities. So the intentionality is what determines what we do with our intelligence. And we can say the machine are intelligent, but they don't have the needs of survival, reproduce themselves, and so on. If we don't put in them this intention, this need, this expectation, and this crucial way of fighting for survival. And so this is why the artist designing the artwork is actually creating artificial intentionalities that go deeper than intelligence, because intentionality cannot be practiced without intelligence, but intelligence is totally useless without intentions. So I will present three artworks, three projects that are exploring at different levels the mutation of the art object that has become an art subject. And this evolution is at the ontological level and the ethological level. And when I say ethological level, I have to be ontological. That means what is an artwork and how these mutations are compatible with the ideas we have in mind about artworks. And the ethological level is if we consider that the artwork is a living entity, it has a behavior, and we should be able to explore this behavior, to understand it, and to understand the ambiguity of a double mind behavior, the artificial mind of the artwork, and the so-called natural mind of the human who would create naturally the artificial and the artificial naturality or the natural artificiality. The most recent of the works, because it hasn't been presented before, that has been done in collaboration with different artists, including Ray LC, that we'll talk later. It's power chess. And it's a way to address the question of our permanent interrogation about who are these machines? What do they want? How do they expect? What do they expect from us? And this is, if we ask this question, it's because we are not sure about the fact that humans are creating something which is totally autonomous, which is not human-made, what artificial means, and that may have either the quality of the human brain and also the flows of a human-made object or subject. Robots are not alive, but they have a behavior. I'm Maurice Benayoun. I'm a media artist. I try to use art to say things about society. Everybody is talking about artificial intelligence. Everybody is talking about how the robots will take our place in society. So the question is, of course, how far can they go in playing our games? Well, how about having the robotic arm playing chess? Okay, play chess. Why? Because then we can play with the change of scale. We can play with the fact that there is something very small that would be, in a way, amplified, even artificially amplified, at the scale of the cathedral. That was the beginning of the discussion of that. This kind of fight between two people, but it's a mental competition. And this would become something on the board, on the chessboard, and I thought, okay, that's interesting. That there is a fight. Fight is always more interesting than just peace. Peace, you don't make a good movie with peace. We have first to work more on one thing, which is the expressivity. How the expressivity of the robot create a kind of ambiguity. How we go beyond this uncanny valley, or how can we walk in the uncanny valley of the artificial behaving very close to the human, but in a different way. And this is how the robots came to life. I thought maybe it's more about power. It's not more about the relation between people. And so it became power chess. This is how I started proposing something that I thought very provocative. Actually, when I've been contacted by FOCA, I was very surprised because I've been contacted to make a new media artwork that would be presented in showrooms. And so this is how I started proposing something that I thought very provocative. I said, sure, I can do something. How about a robot? And of course, the person from FOCA was a bit surprised, but what surprised me was quite interested and said, sure, what are you thinking about? To say something that is, we can change the scale. When we project ourselves on the chessboard, we are actually thinking of the world. It's a world with systems of power that reconfigure itself constantly in order to solve the competition problem.
Okay.
What interests me in the fact to work with sound, with FOCA, and with the robotic arms is that I'm more and more working on the idea that the artwork is not anymore an object. The artwork has become a subject. This subject is able to act, to react, and maybe to have a complex behavior. The complexity of this behavior is what makes it rich, and in a way, it makes it closer to us.
This video is done by FOCA, who commissioned the project. So it has a kind of a commercial look that was not intended at the beginning, but I think it's totally fine that they do their job, I do my job, and that's it. What is not said here, because it's something like 7 episodes on the project, and it will be presented all around the world. And we presented this starting this Sunday in the Osage Gallery. So during the wine sharing party, you will see it either online or on site. And what is not said is that actually the robots are not just playing chess, which would be quite easy. They are playing human conflicts. And so the fight on the chessboard has been redefined in a way that this is sometimes unbalanced. This is sometimes the rules are totally different from the chess rules. And the result is that we can compare the robots as if they would be trying to understand human conflicts, test class struggle, gender equality, Black Lives Matters, and things like that. So they do that on the board by moving the pieces and playing the game, and we see who will win.
So as we don't have an infinite time, and I know how long do I have? Not sure about what I have left.
About 5 minutes. Yeah.
5?
Mm-hmm.
Can you say 8?
Like.
8 maybe. Okay. So let me go to the next thing, because I say that I have 3 examples to present. So the next one, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, value of values. So in the previous one, we see how machines converted into an artwork can address the question of the relation of humans and machine at the same time. Value of values, it's more something about the globalization of human values. So, as you can see, this one is not talking, so I can talk over it. In Value of Values, we start from the Brain Factory project, where the users, the visitors of the exhibition, use EEG electroencephalography headband in order to neurodesign human values. So what does it mean to give shape to values or to human abstractions like space, time? What is the shape of time? What is the shape of abstractions? And so they become brain workers when they come, and they spend something like 8 minutes in the process of designing one specific value, like justice. And justice, at the end of the process, becomes 3D models. So this was in Gwangju in Korea, and the previous one was in Taipei, Mocha Taipei. At the end of the process, you get a QR code, and it's actually registered on the blockchain. So we launched the project 2 years ago, in 2019, June 2019, at Centenary, and people immediately can start collecting values, trading values, swapping values. And this is what makes the project interesting, because they define the relative value of the values, but they do more. For example, they do transactional poetry just by trading or swapping. If I give peace for money, that means something. If I want to keep my happiness, I am ready to give my happiness for a bit of art, or purity or trust, or purity at dawn, respect at dusk, and now pleasure. Or if I give money to get love, I'm making a statement, an ethical statement. And this is what is very specific in this process, is that even when you do something like the transaction, you are saying something about the representation of human values. And in a way, this is the role of the artist to represent things that are not really visible. And so the ranking of the values, this is what you see before. And here, this is the periodic table of the values. And the distance between the different values depends on how people collect them. So if in your collection you have this and that, peace and love, or if you have money and fame, you don't have the same value profile. And this will create distance and relativity in the distribution of values on the table. But you can also use your brain to convert the words of values into calligraphy that will be interpreted by the reader, or read by the reader, and interpreted by the interpreter, that convert the words found by the reader into philosophy, for example. The 3D model resulting of the process may become object of reification, so may become an object. And so it becomes prints, and it's possible to do fashion design out of it, so you can claim the values you believe in. And this is something, of course, important. And so we'll present soon, I hope, this, or will become art installation like purity becoming inflatables, or freedom becoming the footprint of freedom in marble, which must show that freedom is probably vanished a long time ago, and democracy like a honeycomb. And this is a big reificator, making in concrete values, abstractions and values that will vanish when water fall on them like rain. And so that's the Value of Values project, which is a kind of huge project, I have to say, transactional art project. Now, the last one I present today is addressing another question. So it's made with Refik and Adol, and we did in the framework of the Mind Spaces project. We conceived an installation which is kind of specific because we started from the point that in the public space where we were supposed to present this work first is a place with a lot of immigrants. And so we started with the concept of the stranger, the alien, and the immigrant with some similarities, which is to be very different in all matter. Maybe they don't speak the language, they don't know the place. And there are two strangers in this artwork, two aliens and two immigrants that are actually two artworks. And these artworks will try to understand the city, so the environment, understand the people, so their language, and understand the other. So each artwork will try to understand the other artwork. So Refik did one, the Reliant, I did one, the Molayan, and they try to understand each other. So that was the first draft done during the past year of different things, you know, okay, so square and circle, looks simple, but it's not exactly that. And I just would like to show a little bit of the video. So this one, there is no sound on it other than the original. So we presented that in June during the conference Art Machine 2 and the show Construction Context curated by Tobias Klein. And you see here, this is a Molayan, which is living in a kind of fishbowl thing and trying to understand the behavior of people, to react, to establish contact, to create some form of sympathy or empathy, trying to take the color from what happens in front of it. And on the other side, we have the Reliant, which is Refik and Adol's alien, and this alien perceives the people without clearly understanding what they are, and absorb them into their DNA, into its DNA, and it's still confused. And with the time, by a kind of artificial intelligence process, they will become more and more receptive to people between them. And this is what makes this project kind of special. So you will see on the website, because now I'm sure I'm already too long, you will see another video where I explain the project in 360, so you perceive better the space. And I let you see that, or either in 360, so you can navigate and follow the thing. But as I'm explaining the same thing, I'm not showing you that now. So this is a full 360 presentation of the project in the let's say the lobby of the Libeskind architecture, where the School of Creative Media is. I think I'm done.
Great. Thank you very much, Maurice.
I hope I didn't extend too much my time. Did I?
A little bit, yeah, but still modest. Thank you. So thank you, everyone. The next presenter is Dr. Martin E. Rosenberg. Dr. Martin E. Rosenberg's dissertation in 1990 at University of Michigan addressed how 20th century avant-garde artists and philosophers deployed the scientific concept of emergence. He published on Freud and Deleuze, Pound, Duchamp, and Pynchon, Beckett, Cage, Kiki Smith, and Arakawa and Jins. He designed instructional software, theorized about hypermedia, taught hybrid online graduate courses, and published on the role of metaphors like chess in transdisciplinary inquiry. He writes now on the cognitive neuroscience of jazz improvisation. So, Dr. Rosenberg, the floor is yours.
I have unmuted. Can you hear me? Okay, so I'm going to read. I hope you don't mind. So in this introduction, focusing on the audience of Power Chess as witnesses to what is all too human. So I'm pleased to be able to respond to this new work, Power Chess, as I had spent some time earlier in my career thinking through the game of chess with reference to scientific epistemologies, its use as a metaphor, model, and allegory across all disciplines, and pointedly to the 20th century avant-garde deployment of chess to refract as well as reflect dominant cultural thought and behavior. This talk enables me to revisit this old work as I compare it to my current interest in the philosophical implications of the neuroscience of jazz improvisation. With chess, the emphasis lies with cognition grounded by the assumption that decision-making occurs in the silence when time, represented by the game's action, is suspended. With jazz improvisation, time does not stop, and the creative decision-making must occur in the flow of real time as a form of embodied yet distributed cognition. For chess, the oppositional nature of the game as structurally coupled cognition centered on competition and then narratologically extended into attrition warfare can be compared with the distributed nature of jazz as a collaborative event capable of systemic emergence or self-organization through time, from being to becoming. And now I'm going to turn on my screen share. And play my PowerPoint presentation. In Power Chess, we find aspects not addressed by those 20th century artists deploying chess in various ways. In this work, we have the shift from actual artists as objects engaged, such as Marcel Duchamp and John Cage, playing a game which, by wiring the pieces and the board, contingently triggering tape recordings of contemporary compositions written according to the principles of chance, such as Reunion. Here we have Duchamp and Cage playing with Teeny Duchamp, witnessing Teeny Duchamp then takes over for Marcel Duchamp when he gets tired. And now we're transitioning in Benayoun's work to AI robots given synthetic subjectivity to play autonomously, yet which are witnessed by art observers who are therefore seem initially to be subjects observing an art object possessing synthetic subjectivity. We also find that the artificially intelligent robots have been programmed to delay decision-making so that the moves are made at human tempo, so to speak. Allowed to function optimally, one could imagine a game as complicated as one between Boris Spassky and Bobby Fischer, finished by these robots in under 10 minutes, whereas the game itself took place in 4 hours. Furthermore, we find that these robots have been programmed to simulate emotions between moves, so to further the mimesis of human subjectivity for those observing subjects who are, after all, objects of a scientific study of human-computer interface. And the robots have been programmed alternatively to be able to play the game according to eccentric logics or rules which change the behaviors of the pieces involved. So I'm going to now stop the PowerPoint. Oh, here I can do it from here. Okay, temporarily. But there are certain characteristics of chess that do not change from the concerns of the earlier thinkers across disciplines and avant-garde artists. There is an assumption of timeless transcendence between moves, which is coextensive with the underlying geometry of the chessboard itself, as with calculus, quantum mechanics, and general relativity. The behavior of the chess pieces as the robots move them reflects a hierarchical semiosis, which in turn reveals the nature of thought as precise, logically sequential, and action as dynamical, deterministic, and reflecting asymmetries of power. To the point, changing the rules of the game does not change the underlying epistemology of the game itself. For example, to have stalemated pawns on both sides conspire to take out the royalty, so to speak, as one recent meme discovered on Facebook quipped, is not the same as playing all the pieces as anonymous entities functioning according to the rules of Go, where the movement is not dynamical, deterministic, but involving contingent flows irreversibly through time. In Thomas Pynchon's novel, Gravity's Rainbow, there are characters willing to challenge the rules, such as the black girl, quote, a genius of meta solutions, unquote, quote, knocking over the chessboard, shooting the referee, or the character Pokler, who in confronting Weissman, the SS man, quote, cornered him in his office, the speech climaxing as he threw the chessboard in pieces, all into Weissman's arrogantly blinking face. Here I am also I'm already hinting at the scientific epistemological baggage carried by the game or chess as a metaphor, and its cultural and political as well as aesthetic reverberations as that metaphor shifts from one disciplinary domain to another. Let's now address this directly. Chess is metaphor, model, and allegory. The relationship between metaphor and scientific thought has been addressed extensively in the philosophy of science, and I would like to refer to one particular theory that, by extending its purview, has been useful to me. Found in the famous collection by Robert Artoni, Richard Boyd's theory constitutive metaphor proposes that metaphors, to apply a term familiar to readers of Peter Gallison and Bruno Latour, have a kind of agency in the ways it is constitutive of the assumptions underlying the domain from which it is borrowed and which it then carries to new domains. By extension, I have argued that we can conceive of how metaphors might serve as a portal to new domains, possibly acquiring new epistemological baggage as it shifts from one discipline to another. To the point, chess has served as a metaphor, and by extension, as a model for reversible laws of physics exemplified by calculus, more pointedly by Richard Feynman to illustrate the time symmetry of quantum electrodynamics, but also earlier by a range of 19th and early 20th century mathematicians and physicists. It has also been used as a metaphor and model for top-down computational cognition by John von Neumann, Claude Shannon, and Alan Turing, the first two writing influential essays on chess as a paradigm for computation, and Turing for actually writing a program for a chess-playing computer before that computer even came into existence. What a genius he was. This first distinction between time reversible and time irreversible perspectives, as foregrounded by the chess metaphor, even finds its way into linguistics in the synchronic and diachronic model of de Saussure and in the historically contingent model of Wittgenstein. With Wittgenstein, we begin to see emerge a bifurcation in the use of chess as a theory constitutive metaphor distinguishing in its naive appropriation that buys into that epistemological baggage of the reversibility of time, from its ironic appropriation in its subversion of that very same baggage while appealing to an irreversible model of time. From metaphor to model, we now address allegory. Chess has also been deployed to narrate cosmic processes that come to apply through a parallelism to both physical laws and human civilization. Through the application of local symmetries onto an asymmetrical chessboard, the game plays out the larger forces governing both the internal combustion engines and the social orders undergoing reorganization to maximize that machine's economic potential. The reversible laws of physics are applied to control thermodynamic processes of heat in order to produce work. There are two constraints on that control. The boundary conditions point toward inefficiencies with respect to temperature differentiation that indicate dissipation of energy, and macroscopic parameters which point to the inefficiencies of the reversible machinery, which leads to stress, rust, and therefore breakdown of the control over irreversible processes. From Lord Kelvin to Clerk Maxwell, the twofold decline in efficiency found in heat engines applied for the first time to the universe in its entirety toward thermodynamic decline. For the second, by analogy to human civilization, as an allegory picked up by the American Henry Adams and the German Oswald Spengler and applied to human history as the decline of the West. I'm going to turn the PowerPoint back on again. So we find at the most abstract level, chess functioning as a war, not just between kings, but between chance and necessity, played out by the two iterations of the deeply brilliant and hilarious work by John Cage, when he and Duchamp performed a game of chess on stage with a chessboard and chess pieces wired to trigger contingently after each move, a tape recorder playing formal music written by contemporary composers, but which were written according to the principles of chance. Here we have no doubt of the ironic deployment of chess and its epistemological baggage. If there's any precedent to power chess by Maurice Benayoun, sorry to mention your name, Maurice, it is this one. So here I will refer to my hypermedia project, Chess Rhizome, from 1996 to 98, a navigable database containing references to the metaphor of chess across practically all disciplinary boundaries, as that metaphor became deployed to invoke foundational assumptions in each discipline. One can navigate the database by drifting across disciplines following naive or ironic uses of the metaphor of chess. One can also navigate the database by following genealogically users deploying the metaphor sequentially through time. I've already mentioned Ferdinand de Saussure and Ludwig Wittgenstein, exemplifying naive and ironic deployments of chess with regards to linguistics. Clerk Maxwell and Henri Poincaré with respect to physics. Richard Feynman and Ilya Prigogine with respect to physics. Oswald Spengler and Walter Benjamin with respect to history. Ezra Pound and Vladimir Nabokov with respect to literature, while von Neumann and Claude Shannon use both the metaphor naively. Given Alan Turing's role in the mathematics of self-organization and its influence on figures like Ilya Prigogine, one might hesitate in using his experiments with computer chess as naive. Mark Lawrence MacPhail has deployed the model of chess as a game to play out the relationship of resistance and complicity with respect to the role of African-American scholars accepting the fundamentally essentialist discourse of the academy in order to situate themselves polemically with respect to race relations, but in doing so also forcing their complicity in the essentialist discourse which perpetuates racist thinking to begin with. So now let's examine now the genealogical deployment of chess in the avant-garde. Genealogy from Duchamp to Beckett to Cage to Nabokov to Pynchon. Users of chess rhizome can, besides referencing naive and ironic users, instantiate and explore the genealogical drift of chess across disciplines. Marcel Duchamp reached master status in international play in 1925. He co-authored with Vitaly Halberstadt a work on opposition theory and the endgame, Oppositions et les cases conjuguées sont réconciliées, pardon my French, from 1932. That same year, Duchamp also played for the Paris City Championship against Francois Lelianet, a mathematician, game theorist, and future founder of the Oulipo movement of avant-garde poetry and fiction. Duchamp won the Paris tournament in 1933 and translated Znosko Borovsky's masterpiece on opening moves, How to Play Chess Openings, in 1934. Duchamp also played chess with Samuel Beckett on and off for 9 years while living in Paris between the world wars. Beckett wrote a play called Endgame, in which the formal oppositional relationship between the characters can be analyzed using Duchamp's chess treatise. Duchamp also taught John Cage how to play chess while living in New York City in the 1950s. At the second iteration of Cage's compositional chess event in 1968, which occurred before Duchamp's death, Teeny Duchamp was one of the players replacing Marcel, who played for the first event. Duchamp also played chess with Vladimir Nabokov, who wrote a novel called The Defense, modeled on a chess game. Nabokov in turn taught literature and creative writing to Thomas Pynchon, whose novel Gravity's Rainbow has numerous references to chess, as hinted earlier, and in which appears the character named Marcel, the robot chess player. So, of all the figures discussed, it is Duchamp that penetrated furthest into the epistemological baggage of chess as metaphor, model, and allegory. Yet despite criticisms from Robert Smithson and Thomas Pynchon of Duchamp as a 19th century anachronism with respect to chess and scientific epistemology, there's plenty of evidence that not only was Duchamp deploying chess as a theory constituted of metaphor ironically, but also engaged in setting up the metaphor of chess as a portal to new metaphorical baggage and new scientific paradigms. For Duchamp, art is not merely retinal as with impressionistic painting, but should hearken back to medieval uses as it looks towards modernity. Art in the service of the mind refers to its ability to engage with the science and philosophy of the age. So for Duchamp, the game of chess not only becomes a work of art unfolding through time, played out within the shared cognitive field of competing players. It also becomes a commentary, pardon me, of chess as a metaphor, model, and allegory of human cognition. For Duchamp, chess represents a limited model of cognition, a limitation that one ignores at one's peril. Uh-oh, it's not forwarding. Hold on one second. Oh, maybe here. Okay, here. So this is self-portrait done just before Duchamp's death, which I saw recently at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City. In Duchamp's chess treatise, the term opposition associated with the standoff between kings has has a synonym in the term equilibrium, which is a term from thermodynamics, which refers to the end game of thermodynamics or systems death. The aim of the chess treatise is to reestablish equilibrium between the kings in their opposition, which involves a complex form of folding and inverting sections of the chessboard so that the kings seem to emerge out of the same square. In other words, opposition and sister squares reconciled from the title. So given the asymmetry of the chessboard, 64 squares, 8 squares on a side, after each move, the chess player manipulates a small section of the board surrounding a king so that it is folded, then inverted, so the king falls on top of the other king. This superimposes a temporary symmetry onto the asymmetrical chessboard, but this superimposition must be redone by each king after each move. One cannot win using this overdetermined ritual. One can only avoid defeat. The folding and inverting of the chessboard invokes the accomplishments of, let me move this back again. Okay. The folding and inverting of the chessboard invokes the accomplishments of Riemann's n-dimensional geometry, while also underscoring that this involution of geometrical space can only occur outside of time's flow. Human beings create timelessness, and only human beings. As both mathematicians Poincaré and Brouwer point out, geometries are socially constructed, and all mathematics, save for integers and the continuum, are about power and control over the world. In the game of chess, time is suspended between moves, and in this timeless realm, an infinite complexity of enfolding geometry is suggested by the manipulations of the chessboard to preserve equilibrium, to preserve the opposition. Resonating with in Duchampian aesthetics between what he calls delay and exposure, the end of the endgame occurs in a flash, in a breach of opposition, when contingency in the form of a mistake by one of the players intrudes upon the timeless geometry of opposition, so that the delay implied by the perpetual geometry of equilibrium becomes ruptured by the emergence of exposure as the breach of opposition. Here we find the beginnings of Duchamp's transformation of chess from a theory-constitutive metaphor carrying epistemological baggage into a portal into new realms, implying new epistemologies and new paradigms. For Duchamp, that portal is étant donné. Over 20 years in the making, and done while everyone had thought that Duchamp had given up artwork, étant donné, in English, won the waterfall to the illuminating gas, has as its foundation an altered chessboard with intersecting boards in different dimensions represented on a two-dimensional field. Upon this being given to literalize étant donné, Duchamp carefully constructed a tableau composed of a landscape, geological features, objects, and an ambiguous and partial female figure that comprise a series of 4 icons representing icons of becoming. The irreversibility of the waterfall, the complexity of the gas in the lamp, the morphogenesis represented by what goes on within the womb, and self-referentiality. We have the irreversibility of the waterfall, we have the complexity of the gas lamp, we have the woman's womb as site of morphogenesis, which is also the subject of Alan Turing's essay that influenced Prigogine so powerfully. We also have the self-referral implied by the subject position of the art observer as embarrassed voyeur upon witnessing this slightly pornographic tableau. From the calculus of dynamical systems and the infinity of n dimensions possible in transcendent being to the phase space of emergent properties represented by these 4 icons. we might remind the audience that while Ilya Prigoghine's work on self-organizing processes far from equilibrium began during World War II, it was not until the mid-60s that a new paradigm seemed to be emerging out of the work of Prigogine, René Thom, Henri Ottelon, as well as others, and which was fully recognized with Prigogine's Nobel Prize in 1977. We would have to wait until 1990 for the new paradigm of embodied, emergent, enactive, and extended cognition, or the 4 E's, to be announced by the manifesto of Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenberg. We're almost out of time. So,
Okay, so I just have a little bit more.
Thank you.
But we would also have to wait until the publication of Deleuze and Felix Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus before the full implications of chess as a theory constitutive metaphor becomes realized only through its juxtaposition with Go as competing game theories of war, each with distinct epistemological baggage. Chess exemplifies the reversible model of time and the top-down computational paradigm of cognition. Go exemplifies the irreversible model of time and the bottom-up model of emergent properties. Let us remind ourselves of the difference between drawing upon Varela and Thompson and Roche's work. To conclude, Power Chess highlights the limits of the projection of artificial intelligence as human intelligence and the threat that this limited account of human cognition poses. The delay built into the game's decision-making hints at the delay and exposure of Duchamp's account of art and chess. The simulation of human emotion underscores its absence from the spontaneous manifestations of artificial intelligence. The reference to Power of Chess as an allegory for the superimposition of symmetry onto an asymmetrical world reiterates the critique of mathematics itself as both socially constructed and implicated in the will to power. As such, it offers a needed reminder that we are authors of the forces that are posed to replace us. Think now of the audience of Power Chess, the 1% power elite who buy $150,000 to $300,000 audio speakers, an audience who've made a fortune from this limited frame to human cognition of reversible time and top-down cognition, which is now destroying the world. They are the objects of the human-computer interaction study to which we and the planet are subjected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rosenberg.
Thank you, Martin.
So next up, we will go to Dr. Beatrice de Gelder. And Dr. Beatrice de Gelder is a professor at Maastricht University in the Netherlands and the director of the Brain and Emotion Lab. Her main area of expertise are the neural basis of visual and audiovisual processes and associated clinical deficits of visual perception and communication. Her current research focuses on face and body perception using a variety of brain imaging methods, also in combination with VR and recently, the neuroscience of art. She has published over 300 scientific articles, and her book on emotions and the body was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. She obtained major funding from the EU, FET, ERC Advanced, and ERC Energy. So please, Dr. de Gelder, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share screen now. That should work without difficulty. All right. Well, thanks for having me in this very interesting symposium. I get this thing off. Always speaker, yes. Okay. Presentation mode. Good. I start with the least possible original image, the image of the human brain, the image of the human sensory system, with all the different senses represented here. We'll get to why this is an important point. In fact, I'm going to concentrate on the visual cortex in this talk, although of course there's very many possibilities to look at multisensory connections, which are very important for our topic, but that would get us too far. So in the background of my presentation is this question on how we can envisage the art neuroscience exchanges. To maybe repeat something that somebody has been hinted at already, in my view, there is currently, and there has been for a while, a major stumble block, namely that current, at least in some areas, current thinking about art and current neuroscience share a same problem, namely both have a very human-centric vision of the brain. I'll give some examples of that. For example, intentionality is typically both in art and in neuroscience. Currently, things are changing in neuroscience, and it's important that the artistic reflection is aware, I think, of these changes in neuroscience. Intentionality is typically still associated with higher cognitive and artistic processes, with the authentic, unique, subjective state of mind. That picture is changing in neuroscience as we know more, we still know very little, but we know more and more about the brain. We should really realize that we know still very little about the brain. So given this human-centric vision of the brain, facing non-humans like the kind of non-humans referred to in the title of this symposium, we tend to assume, we tend to attribute quasi-mental abilities, quasi-minds to those entities. And we copy them. What we attribute them is actually copied after what we think we understand about our own mind. And that's what I mean by this human-centric vision of the brain, which drags down thinking in art and in neuroscience alike. For example, the current interest for big data and the kind of use that is made in applied neuroscience and in the arts fits that kind of vision. For many artists want to have neural data, want to have data, and with this notion that those data will help to read the mind conceived in this very traditional picture of this unique human power. And in contrast with that, there is this very interesting notion that we have in the title of this symposium that Maurice has been stressing, namely that of artificial intentionalities. Now, I'm going to expand on that notion of artificial intentionalities by talking a little bit about some work that's going on very, very recently in neuroscience of visual perception. And I'll try to extend some messages, some information and messages about that from that. Just to give you a first idea, this is a very familiar view, of course, and it shows you the incredible complexity we are facing when we try to understand visual perception. I mean, this is an older image, it's 25 years old, and just to note, things have not become simpler. It's not the case that with more and more knowledge about all those connections and areas, we got to a simpler picture, to rather the opposite. So given that, I'm bringing this one up to raise the question, what can we say about how the brain understands visual images? How can we, can we say something about it that's actually relevant, potentially important for the art as well as for the neuroscience area? A very simple question is, and that's the one I'm going to be concerned with in the coming 5 minutes, what specific features should visual neurons of the kind we have seen in the brain image in the previous slide, what specific features should we think that visual neurons encode, given the infinity of real-world images and the limited number of neurons available to present on them? In the past, we have given to that, in the past, I mean, think like about 30 years ago, we had a very human-centered image of that. We thought that the brain was representing the sort of image properties and image categories that we thought were important. There has been some progress, and progress is really becoming very, very important in the last couple of years. But there were early discoveries that showed some kind of understanding. But what happened is that researchers handpicked some image properties that we thought to be important, and could establish some correspondences between them and brain activities and neuron activities. For example, that was shown for specific motion direction, was shown for binocular disparity, was even, to the surprise of many people at the time, was shown for complex natural shapes like faces, for example. We got a little bit suspicious about this very simple relationship between let's call them symbolic categories or everyday categories and brain processes. And people wanted to push a little bit further. I mean, is this really what's going on, right? Because as we all realize, the brain is like not some kind of camera that stores images of faces and keeps them ready for when we need to recognize a person. So people began to be a little bit skeptical about handpicking stimuli and try to test neurons with systematic deformations of images to get a little bit more at what might actually be coded by those billions of neurons. One interesting finding, by the way, was that some studies found that neurons often tend to respond better to distorted versions of original stimuli than to real ones. For example, this is one kind of study, and this is actually not centuries ago, as you can see here. This is a study from a very important study from 2014. So people tried to deform images to really zoom in on what was actually going on in the brain. Okay, so you see various starting with huge databases of images and trying to vary and go to distortions, etc. Still, there was this notion that handpicked categories, that to test how the brain works with handpicked categories, which of course handpicked always, when we handpick categories, we always stay in the realm of natural recognized objects for which we have concepts, etc., etc. So people started wondering, and that's a very interesting issue I feel to be very interesting. I mean, what are we missing when we just limit our investigations to the things, to the categories and the labels and the symbolic categories we know? Are we actually not missing properties of objects that are not so easily accessible to our phenomenological reflection, but that might actually correspond to true tuning of cortical neurons? And this is where AI started coming in a very interesting way and very relevant way for our thinking about the relation between art and science. Because people started using genetic algorithms to create an extended image space and to see which image in that extended image space might lead to the maximal neuronal firing. And we stepped away from using stimuli that represented familiar categories, familiar people, and revealed novel patterns there. Okay, I'm going to give some examples of that in a second. But another way was, what's interesting here is to understand the logic of these approaches. Okay, rather than testing what neurons respond to with familiar categories, everyday objects, whatever things for which we have linguistic labels and symbols, people try to sort of create artificial stimuli, or create a range of stimuli that goes from artificial to real and back. And here, this is one example, is what it's from a very recent article also. People have tried to sort of what was called text forms. Let's just give the gist as an example. So you can, on the left, you see the artificially created text form for objects, small objects, animals, etc. And on the right, of course, you see the original. So we want to know what exactly is it about the visual object that the brain is coding, since we can no longer assume that the brain is coding what we think it is coding, right? Here is an example of what I just hinted at, namely how you can avoid assumptions about features or semantic categories by using a genetic algorithm that searches the whole space, the whole stimulus space, going systematically using an algorithm to create a big variety of images that cover the whole image space of one stimulus, and see just what it is that the brain is reacting to, that the neuron is reacting to. Maybe it's something different at different stages. So these are the kinds of questions. Just trying to get to the next image, which seems to be a little difficult. Sorry, I'm getting to the next one. Seem to have a little freezing here. Okay, it takes a bit of time. Now, just how good is this procedure? It's certainly, and everybody agrees, it's certainly better than what I said, handpicking stimuli to test how the brain achieves visual perception. But there is a big issue there, a massive issue there, namely a massive issue here, namely to what extent we cannot assume that the brain works under the same constraints than an AI model. For example, and that's of course a big topic in itself, for example, to give one example of the difference between the brain and an AI model, is that the brain operates under very limited energy constraints. Energy for the brain is a scarce commodity, unlike the massive computers we use to run simulations of object recognition. So one way to realize this is to change focus and not just consider every possible stimulus that is generated by an AI system, but to try to find when we can narrow this down, by taking into account the fact that the brain is a phylogenetically ancient system, and it is shaped, built, carved out of the various possibilities of brain modeling. It is shaped by interactions, organisms, and environments. So that in whatever way the details of the brain representation, we do have to acknowledge that in contrast to an artificial system, brain representations are the residue of interactions between organisms and environments. And in this kind of context, and there is no time to work on this, to develop that idea. Maybe we can go back to when we have questions about that. But in that kind of, I see in a way that I will try to explain, I see this work of Maurice in that kind of context. Namely, where this image of Maurice's work fits in my understanding of it, is in the context of an alternative way to generate possible images to explore brain encoding and artistic practice. We still start from real images and processes. We can still use AI for image analysis and multiple image generation, because we don't want to test the brain with very limited, we have to test the brain with huge libraries of images. So we still use AI for generating image spaces, large image spaces. we use AI to discover a certain level of features, and then we test candidate features against brain data, and we hope to discover biological primitives at a subjective level. Subjective because we are not dealing with a sort of pre-organized selectivity of the images, with images we understand symbolically, but with images that what I call here mid-level features, which is below the symbolic feature. Okay. And what I want to argue, and there won't be time, I just throw this out for you for discussion. What I want to argue is that at this kind of level, this kind of sub-symbolic representation level, the sub-subjective representation level, that's where we find the carriers of human, non-human intentionality. That's where we interact with non-human agency, etc. Not at the level where we attribute mental processes to them, higher order mental processes to them, but at the level of understanding the similarities between their behavior and our behavior. An example of that, and I'm actually almost finished, I will not go over my time. An example of that is some current work we are doing in the context of the question, how does, since the human body is an incredibly important stimulus for humans and for interactions between humans and quasi-humans, if you want to call them, like artifacts, avatars, robots, etc. We have to better understand how the human brain, the human visual perception deals with human bodies. And we use this logic of trying to create a vast stimulus set, which is created by having a bunch of dimensions and then varying along these dimensions possible body representations, achieving in a algorithmic way, achieving various alternative body figures. For example, here, if we use like one standard deviation from the center, we get these. If we use 5 standard deviations, we get some possible and some biomechanically impossible human body representations. I'm not going to go on to that kind of work. Another thing we can do, again, is to use extended video analysis and to look, to have the computer analyze this image. This is actually a video clip, as you can see, of an angry person. We can have the computer analyze that image. The computer analyzes features. We are not labeling the image, right? We are not labeling the image in any way, but we let the computer analyze what are the relevant features, and then we map this. We try to map this computer analysis, what the computer comes up with as relevant features of this and a whole bunch of other images. We try to match that against the data we get, for example, in fMRI. And that yields us, what we have shown is that this yields sort of mid-level features, which are where the distinction between the different body expressions is taking place. And they are not like the high order categories. Okay. That's getting us to my last slide. There is a little delay, which must be due to the internet. My apologies for that. There's nothing. Okay, yes, that's what I said already. So we match the computer analysis of the videos against the activity of the brain with methods that can be detailed but don't really matter here. That way we find that, for example, here a feature limb contraction, which is like a quantifiable feature of the video image, that relates to systematically to what's going on in certain brain areas, and also relates systematically to an assignment of in this case of fear. Okay, good. My last slide then. This alternative way to generate possible images to explain brain coding is also directly related to artistic practice. And I will only focus on the bold parts, because the other ones had been seen in the previous slide. What I propose is that the kind of features we discover with AI methods, and which try to zoom in on what happens in mid-level features of visual perception, that these are the carriers of human, non-human intentionality. For example, the movements made by the chess players in Maurice's work, that these mid-level representations are body anchored and behavior based, and in interacting with whatever organism that displays this kind of behavior, we absorb, like shown in Maurice's work Dialogue, we absorb the information, and then information becomes part of the body of the interacting agents. And you could, that is my way of understanding artificial intentionality, namely that at this mid-level features, we find the encoding of the subpersonal intentionalities, which is, I think, a modest way of reckoning with the fact that we do, to some extent, have very fluid interactions, very fluid quote unquote conversations with non-human agents. And this is an understanding that is not liable to be burdened by the biases, by what I started with in the beginning, by this overly human-centered image of artistic and human visual perception. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I guess I can start introducing Tanya while everyone comes back and turns their camera back on. So here we go. So Dr. Tanya Ravn Ag is a Danish curator and scholar focused on perceptual experience and technogenesis in relation to media art and urban media aesthetic phenomena. Following a research fellowship at the School of Creative Media, City University of Hong Kong, she is currently a postdoc researcher at the Center for Art as Forum, Institute of Art and Cultural Studies at the University of Copenhagen. She chairs the IIAC, which is ISEA International Advisory Committee, and has edited Digital Dynamics in Nordic Contemporary Art by Intellect 2019, and co-edited What Urban Media Art Can Do, Why, When, Where, and How via AV Edition 2016. So yes, now we would like to invite Dr. Tanya.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And my presentation, I believe it will be run from the headquarters of the symposium in Hong Kong. So I'll remember to say next in between my slides. And I'll just wait a second until it is on. Thank you. So my talk today is titled Speculations on Entanglements of the Art Subject with Human Technogenesis. And it will draw on my research on technogenesis in relation to media art, which continues my work at the Neurodesign Lab at City University of Hong Kong on the topic of expanded reality. And it especially focuses on the temporal qualities that artwork in our perceptual experience with art in perspective of contemporary technogenesis. And I will mention straight up that unlike Beatrice, I'm not a neuroscientist. I operate in the field of cultural studies, art research, media studies. So this will be my contribution from this perspective. Next. So I'll try to contribute to our overall question for this panel, which is post-human art is far too human. And this question, I think Maurice also introduced it in the beginning, has a Nietzschean reference, as Maurice also reminded us the other day, from his book, Human All Too Human from 1878, with the philosophical quest to observe human nature and to find solutions to problems. And in this particular book, Nietzsche is not exactly looking to art and myth to restore cultural unity, but he explores the possibility of grounding culture on scientific knowledge. And I will try to contribute a little bit to this premise. Next. So the thesis guiding my research overall and today on art is that art has always co-evolved with techniques and participated in human technogenesis. In the contemporary perspective of this, which is what I'm going to delve into today, I seek to understand how art behaves as a technocultural phenomenon beyond how it is conceptualized or cast to operate in perspective of the long course of human evolvement with techniques. Sometimes we classify the art as being one thing, or we call it something because we've been doing that for 60 years or hundreds of years, but maybe that is not equivalent to how the whole art actually behaves and the role it actually has to our cultural evolution. And I will jump off from this thesis with 3 questions that are guiding my presentation today. Next. First of all, what is the art subject, which Maurice also introduced before? Secondly, how is the art subject entangled with human co-evolvement with techniques? And thirdly, how can the art subject, as entangled with human technogenesis, be thought in relation to the posthuman and as having a role in our dealing with posthuman related problems that we are currently facing, a quest I'm extending a little bit from the Nietzschean point of departure. Next. So I will start off on a note of speculation. Perhaps we can imagine that 1,000 years from now, in a perhaps different perceptual dimension, a human being will research the meanings and the technological traces of a time in art's existence when the human species changed along technocultural narratives that were co-formulated by the art subject. The researcher's inquiry, which will equally guide my presentation today, is to try to grasp art as more than an object, concept, event, or other phenomenon that is conceptualized and defined by a small community of the so-called art world during the 20th century, that is back in the 20th century. She's researching a moment in art's evolution, a moment that is contingent with a time during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, characterized by a particular condition of techniques that at that time accelerates along a Western-defined narrative of rationality, optimization, and acceleration, a linear progression. Next. The researcher has been searching through the ether of an ancient blockchain system and made a specific find. And this is an art trait of peculiar nature, which can be dated to approximately year 2019. It's made by an artist with the name then of Maurice Benayoun. It is not an object, not a concept, not an installation or performance, or what other genre categories people used at the time to describe the natures of art. The art trace exists through a digital materiality in a non-static form and has an active capacity. Next. The researcher is seeking to understand the deeper narratives of how art participates in human technogenesis and therefore looking at the art trace in a particular manner. Although it can be dated, she's not interested in a linear timeline of art history. She's looking for how, in the aesthetic and functional qualities of the art, the past is nestling inside the present and the present is carrying the embryo of the future, quoting the theorist and Catherine Hales. She's interested in the meaning and evolutive consequences of the ways in which the artwork engages human perception, emotion, and memory, and takes part in human communicated existence. Next. Now, our advantage today is that we are still just coming out of our present and we have access to first-hand experience of the art. And I'll share my first-hand experience of actually creating this artwork. What we see here is a representation of the digital artwork, which is titled Space 0000, The Birth of Space. The attentive person watching this might notice it in the background. I apologize that my lamp is in the way, but it's actually hanging on my wall. So next. As the researcher will find out, the artwork is produced during a time, I think next. The artwork is produced during a time in art's evolution when art is undergoing changes in its nature and very ontology. And this ontological shift is something that Maurice and I have been discussing much and writing about, and we have proposed the starting of a new taxonomy of media art practices centered around the notion of the art subject. Next. I show you these models from our paper, and I won't go into the details here, but I will just summarize our definition of the art subject. The art subject is a term evolved based on technologically developed qualities of the art object to become sentient and co-evolve with its public and environment from the intentionality of the artist. And this idea guides a currently emerging mode of art as an active phenomenon that evolves with humans and environments through transductive processes. This is what we arrived at, among other things, in our paper. So to elaborate just briefly, the idea of the art subject involves an alteration in how we think about art and how we understand its modes of existence, and not least its modes of implication in the world. It operates through a mode of transduction, the idea that a process develops according to a dynamic relation between the being and the potentialities of its environment or milieu. The art subject is a subject in the world. Not yet. Thanks. We see how art penetrates layers of our informational ecosystem, from overflowing the frame of the art world to infiltrating urban media processes that mediate our everyday lives, even infiltrating the blockchain. And this we in the paper elaborate further with Gilbert Simondon, for whom transduction announces a process or an action that comes out of an energetic field, especially related to communication and transmission. So the transductive process extends from memories and anticipations, conceptions, and complexities of technological invention and innovation to formations of intentions and even actions. It engages deep anchored memory of the body and the brain in its environment of experience. And my analysis will jump freely between the parameters of the model that we are seeing here, the model that I had on the left before, which is depicting the art ontological shift. It's a model by Maurice. I will credit him fully for it. I will focus on one quality especially that is going through all these different layers, which is temporality. Next. And from here, I will jump on to the second question on my agenda. How does the art subject participate in human technogenesis? That is our co-evolvement with techniques. And of course, I'm not going to be able to answer this fully, but I would like to propose something that could be useful. Okay, next. Now, it happens that the particular art subject of our investigation is co-created by me. The abstract shape that is attributed the value of space was then further reified by someone else into a new shape, and then someone else, and then someone else. So all these reifications, together with other reifications of other values, as Maurice explained and introduced the project earlier, will be admitted to the blockchain as values, where they can be bartered and their relative values will occur. But in my analysis here, I will focus on the situation in which the very first iteration of the abstraction of space was created. The shape of this abstraction is created from EEG data captured by brain-computer interaction. So my emotional response reifies the shape through BCI. And this is through real-time biofeedback between a virtual generated process and my brain's associated response. The data of my engagement with the abstract shape on the screen in front of me is calibrated within a framework of binary outcomes. The rules of the calibration process, the translation of data into abstraction, and for my co-creation of the work overall, derives from the intentionality of the artist. Next. We need to consider that my embodied process of making sense of the abstraction happens in a mutual engagement of perception and imagination. And I'm drawing a little bit on the work of Bernard Stiegler in this part. We should keep in mind that the fabric of thought that we think we experience is a confabulation, that our imagination is at work when we make sense of things. My perceptual system is fragile. Our visual system works to create an experience of coherency, but what we normally see as reality is actually only a result of our immediate ability to draw emotions, images, meanings, and eventually memories out of our experience. And the process of how this works, I'm not the right person to answer this. But in that sense, our cognitive mechanisms simplify the complexity of the world to become understandable to our needs. So our perception thus reveals, hides, constructs, and reconstructs reality in our experience and relies on imagination for selecting what to take in and how to make sense of it. So my point here is that perception and imagination, which engage different memory levels, they blend together, and a kind of selection mechanism is at work in my real-time engagement with and creation of the abstraction, which depends on both conscious and unconscious criteria. Next. The interface or the screen that I was looking at when I was wearing the EEG helmet, it might seem like it is correlating directly to my mode of sensory experience and cognitive processing, but in part it only indirectly correlates to my experience, since it involves technical operations to which I lack a direct access. And here I'm drawing on the work of Mark Hansen. If we seek deeper into the real-time process that is happening in the real-time, the biofeedback between the virtual generative process and my brain's associated response, it is that different timescales of human cognition and machine cognition intermesh. The temporalities on the human side can roughly be broken down temporally as follows. And here I'm leaning on Catherine Hales again. So she mentions how the time it takes for a neuron to fire is 0.3 to 0.5 milliseconds. The time it takes for a sensation to register in the brain is between 80 milliseconds and 500 milliseconds. That is 150 to 1,000 times slower than neural firing. The time it takes the brain to grasp and understand a high-level cognitive facility, like recognizing a word, for example, is 200 to 250 milliseconds, meaning 6 times slower than the lower estimates for registering a sensation. And then the time it takes to understand a narrative could be minutes, hours, or longer. So these processes are, of course, happening simultaneously and at different rates concurrently. The point to be taken here is that insights are reached through enfolded timescales, and in that process, consciousness is always belated. Now, our machines, on the other hand, operate by very fast processing at the level of logic gates and bit reading that work much faster than my conscious mode of comprehension. Computational processes occur at timeframes that are below the threshold constitutive of human perceptual experience and seem to introduce levels of operationality that impact our experience, but that do not have any direct perceptual correlate. And this means we're not conscious of the consequences to our actions. We're perceiving something, but actually it might operate differently than what we consciously think, and we might act in a way where we cannot actually trace the rooting of that action in relation to our perceptual experience. Next. So what this meshing of human and machine temporality results in are operational processes that function as a kind of technical memory or support structure, which affects how perception and imagination are at work. And this technical support structure evolves from not just from when the Brain Factory project by Maurice and Tobias Klein was developed, and not just from the beginning of the computer. It evolves from a long process of evolutionary adaptation of technical tendencies and their logics. So the mutual interference between temporalities of machinic systems and human temporal functions of consciousness means that our creation of abstractions and forms, content, systems, meaning is not rooted in a direct human relation with what we create, but we feed forward a mode of a technical tendency, which is also way beyond the experience with the art in that very moment. And this is not a purely technical process. Our bodies also have a biological capacity for memory and evolutionary adaptation to carry the past into the present. And this mechanism we can explain by what Bernard Stiegler calls the epiphylogenetic principle, which inscribes a woven texture of all activity whereby data is fed forward and certain programs are transmitted through communities and historical epochs via habit and repetition. And this could be how, for the artwork as the art subject, that the past nestles inside the present and the present carries the embryo of the future. And perhaps the artwork speaks to this, since it relies on a sense of distributed sensibility among the people who participate. So the future iterations of the work will inherit the form that I pass on, which will thus continuously evolve from biofeedback from everyone who engaged with the form and concept. In this case of the concept of space. Next. So almost wrapping up, how can the art subject entangle with human technogenesis be thought in relation to the post-human and as having a role in our dealing with post-human related problems that we are currently facing? And I think that seeing art in this extended or larger temporal perspective as entangled with human technogenesis Genesis actually frees the art from its entrapment in a dualism between, on the one hand, technological pessimism nurtured by Marxist critical theory, and on the other hand, technological optimism headed by capitalist technological innovation, and which indirectly come to show the way for artistic language and discourse. Next. So rather than searching to position the art in this dichotomy, the future researcher would see the art as a part of a larger narrative with technology in which human experience is undergoing change caused by our entanglement with contemporary techniques. And this is an epoch when, this is currently an epoch when media impact the general sensibility of the world prior to and as a condition for impacting human experience. In this epoch, our current narrative, we seek to control matter with human rationality, but the thing is that we are unsuccessful at that. The mode of rationality driving invention and innovation today is shaped by temporal processes that we enact, but that we are not all consciously aware of. Next. The BCI iteration of the abstraction reminds us that we rely on technologies to perform operations like giving shape and meaning to an abstraction, but to which we have no direct access and that correlate to no already existing human faculty or capacity. Here's an echo of Mark Hansen again. In perspective of the posthuman, we are not becoming robots and our brains are not computational hard drives. Information cannot circulate unchanged through humans and different material substrates, and it changes in different ways in all of us. But we need to rethink agency as composed by both multi-scalar and multi-temporal human embodied processes and machinic operations that are linked with inworlded processes, to borrow this term from Mark Hansen. And maybe this resonates a little bit with some of what Beatrice, you were mentioning before. Next. So in conclusion, in response to our question, space 0000 might pass on an advice to us very much directed to our post-human future. It is an illusion that we think we can control the creation and meaning-making of our abstractions. In the Western rationalized expectation to control matter and the shaping of the world, abstract, artificial, and natural, we are somewhat blind to the fact that we cannot rely on human rationality, ethics, and truth-seeking behind such controlling. At least we have to be very, try to be very conscious about what is going on. And this is a serious problem that we are currently facing. With the creation of the abstraction, we experience in real time that there is a relationship between thought and matter. Though we cannot decipher how it precisely works, we are forced to give up control in a way. So that's an awareness that occurred in me at least. We accept to pass on the abstraction to the next person to make a further iteration. And in that process, the memory that is passed on is in the technical logic of the machine, while the human experience is somehow lost or frozen with the previous audience iteration. And this is something to be concerned with. Next, and I'm done now. So we can discuss if at this point it seems that we have too much faith in consciousness, since much of what guides our perception and decisions bypasses our conscious faculty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Bypassing. Interesting. Thank you very much. We will discuss a bit further later on. Next up is Dr. Ray Elsey's practice. Dr. Ray Elsey's practice creates interaction environments for building bonds between humans and machines. He takes perspectives from neuroscience, Pubs Nature, J Neurosci, and HCI publications such as CHI, DIS, HRI in his artistic practice, with exhibitions at New York Hall of Science, Art Electronica, Bank Art, Electra, New Museum, SARI, New York Documentary Film Festival, JCCAC, and Osage. He practices artistic interventions to probe our spatial relationship with machines, funded by National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, Horizon Connected Futures, Adobe Design Award, Microsoft Imagine Cup, Cone Foundation, Davis Peace Foundation, and New York Foundation for the Arts. So there we go. Thank you very much, Dr. Ray. Elsie, all yours.
Hello, I will share my screen. Let's see. Cool. Thanks so much for the invitation, Maurice and Lisa. Super happy to meet everybody here because we also have these really complementary perspectives. That's what makes this panel really fun. So we've heard from neuroscientists and criticism and philosophy, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully I complement that view a little bit with some human-computer interaction work, in addition to the artwork. So I want to start by telling folks about storytelling, actually. But storytelling actually tells us about the people who actually tell the story. So, for example, in this case, I have this famous, well-known story where, like, someone threw me into the. My dad threw me into the water to teach me how to swim, right? So you can interpret that in many ways. So one way to interpret that is, okay, this is where I am now, so what you had to do was take risks to create a business. So your dad did the right thing, basically, right? But it could also be like, don't trust your authority. Like, despite your dad doing that, you fight for your own rights, and you can make it happen on your own. So either of those interpretations could be right, depending on the context. So we understand the people and devices by stories, right? The interpretations that we give to things actually tell you about what we feel and think about. And really, stories are what I think of as misperceptions, because stories lead to these new interactions about things that you don't know about. So for instance, in this case, we have a bunch of kids in the workshop who, by wearing disguises, gets it so that the computer cannot recognize their face from computer vision. So I want to tell you today a few stories of hybrid practice. Hopefully I get to a small number of them, including work by Maurice Power Chess. So I start very early work in which I made basically a lamp, which is shy. So if you look closely at this lamp, it will shy away. But when it's far away, when you're far away from it, it kind of curiously looks at you. The reason for this project was I looked at the use of machine learning by a lot of current works, which is based on complementing humans, right? But what I really wanted to look at was actually, what about the machines themselves? What about the machines that have an unexpected action? How do we perceive them? And what does that perception say about us? Getting back to the misperception part. So this is what the lamp looks like. If you get close, it's gonna look away. Anyways, I use it to tell stories, and that was the project there. The next thing I did was actually vary that into a multiple kind of machines. They all basically have individual character, and basically they all like stare at you at the same time when you are looking at them. And then when you're not looking at them, they kind of do their own game, or they're playing this like Romeo and Juliet skit on the side. I don't have time to show you the story, but this is the kind of stuff that I was doing with, how you can get perceived by multiple machines at the same time. So it's sort of a natural extension of the single lamp work. So then I moved on to a residency at New York Hall of Science and continued to explore this theme of machine and human interaction. And so here I work with a surveillance camera. The surveillance camera actually has the story attached to it. It comes from a supermarket in San Francisco from the 1970s. We salvaged the parts, added these like fancy machine learning, computer vision algorithms to it. And then because it's a surveillance camera, it will like look around, the hall to see if there's any like, misbehaving characters, anywhere. And then when it sees someone, it looks at it, and then it kind of plays with it as well, right? So this is the kind of interaction you see with this old security camera. And when it detects your face, it basically projects your face onto that face sculpture there. So yeah, it was really fun to work at New York Hall of Science. They're actually going through a lot of problems with the hurricane and stuff, so I really wish them good luck. So I might have just enough time to show just a little bit of this video. So hopefully you guys can still see. It's okay if you guys not getting the sound. I just want to show you a little bit of the interaction. This is kind of the movie part of it a little bit. Let me just show you people having fun with it, right? They love, kids love these misbehaving security cameras. You don't know when they're going to start looking at you. And actually, as Maurice might kind of somewhat suspect, there are some of this remnant of these gestures, and kind of these gesture set that, we started playing with and then we apply to bigger works, for example, in power chess. Okay, so getting back to the presentation. So again, kids love playing with these robots in these workshops. So now I want to get to a recent work by Maurice, and I and Per Magnus and others helped out, of course, at the Neuro Design Lab. So I wanted to tell about specifically the thing that I brought into the project, which is having these characters and interesting gestures, both in the single robotic arms themselves, but also, as I will tell you about, the multiple arms interacting with each other. And actually, it's very natural, as you can see, very natural flow from what I was working on before, basically. So the first thing we did in terms of kind of more science-y level of work, is to look at what single robot gestures are telling us, right? So how do people perceive these types of gestures? So for example, the ones on the top here, you can see is basically this robot which is doing this kind of examination of the key. It's like, okay, should I do this or should I do that, right? It's this kind of hesitation. And then on the bottom here, it took us like a good week to do this, working with the RA, Tony, but just breathing takes a lot of work, right? Because you could breathe like this, you could breathe like this. It depends on how you want to do it, and it takes a lot of work to kind of tune the parameters just right so that it's breathing the right way. It has this personality and character to it. So let me show you a couple of other more kind of explicit gestures. One where it's just like standing up and alert. It's like, oh, what's going on, right? So you will be able to see some of these gestures at play if you come to the exhibit. And then you have another one where they're kind of staring up at this other characters are you sure? Is that what you want to do? So the graph here might not be easy to understand, but basically the higher values are basically in green. And that just means that these particular gestures are recognized to be especially possessing some of these properties. So we did a survey with audience, basically. So we gave people these videos and then allowed them to, naturally express what they think about them. So this is the work of Hongshen Xu in my lab. And so, for example, the head turn one has really high curiosity, as you can imagine, because they're going like this, right? So that's expressive of the curiosity. And then, for example, standing up is very aggressive perceived, right? And then same thing, if you're deliberating, then you're going to be low on decisiveness, right? So all of this makes sense, although having seen it in actual robots as opposed to humans actually is already a contribution. Now, I think the next level of interesting thing that we see is actually now what about robot-robot interaction? So now we're going to show a movie. Actually, this is much longer video in which the robot on the right is kind of more aggressively playing the game. Okay, so not only is it playing the chess moves more aggressively, but it's also kind of acting more aggressively by using these gestures as I show here. Right. So when you do that, actually, so first of all, people perceive this behavior, but they also say some really interesting things, right? So they say naturally things like, oh, the right robot is playing assertively and quickly, etc. Right? But they also say give you stories, right? They'll tell you oh, the overly confident left robot meets the silent killer right robot, right? We didn't, we just asked them to describe it as a story, right? And then we have some really more interesting stuff. Two love robots love to engage with each other in all ways, competitive and playfully. These to like each other, and they like to have a little fun without hurting each other's feelings, right? So anyway, so you can see that the perceptions of these robots are really interesting and strong. Now, it's also interesting that the way that humans intend to play a game against such a robot that they perceive also is going to differ, right? So what that means is, for example, because the right robot is really aggressive at its play, right? So the human intention against them is now not to be quite as aggressive, right? So it'll be conservative and tries to kind of defend, right? So what that means is not only is it perceiving the robot to have a certain character, its actual intended action, the people's intended action actually reflects that. And that's a very interesting contribution, that it's actually action-based. Now, we would have to do the next step to actually let people play the game, right? That would be the next step to do, but at least they have this intention. That's really interesting. So anyways, there's also some really interesting quotes, right? That is really actually probably even more interesting than the quantitative results, right? They would say things like, well, okay, how do I play against the right robot? I'm going to be assertive and aggressive, but I would let first the robot think that I was being casual and friendly, right? So they actually come up with these really interesting strategies based on what they see in the video, right? So they can actually perceive these differences in the actual chess gameplay, right? The left robot seems to be watching the moves played by the right robot and then responding accordingly, right? And of course, there's always the absurdist in the room who's like, two robots playing chess, but they aren't really getting anywhere. Okay, so anyway, so I think this is a really fun study in itself, in addition to looking at the artwork as well. And I think the other really interesting thing that actually Maurice brought on as something that we can look at, and we ended up actually doing a small study on it, is to look at how do people perceive the robot as sort of a head versus the robot as more of a hand, right? So the head is basically perceived in this picture where if you see the robot in a certain context, it looks like it's using its kind of gripper as a head motion, but it can also be perceived as a hand type motion. And we can actually set up certain situations so that people perceive them differently in either case. And this graph actually just shows you that it's very distinct where they're perceiving this. So it's kind of either on this side or on the other side. They're either totally perceiving them as a hand at a head, as opposed to this kind of arm and the body. All right, so really interesting the way that people perceive these. So in the last little bit of time that I have remaining left, I just want to tell you very briefly about a couple of other projects that tries to look at these machine perception and human perception area. So I have this work at Osage Gallery earlier. We call it I Was of Three Minds. You're gonna know why that in a second. But there's a set of three pieces, and I'll tell you just about one of them because this is the one that's most related to our work. So these are actually videos that are playing on the CRT TVs. The ones that are playing, actually, they are playing computer vision interpretation of dances, right? And these dances are actually choreographed and performed by me and people I know, basically dancers I know. And so the human view of it is, if you watch the original video, not the machine vision-based one, you're going to see dancers, you're going to see a performance, and you're going to catch the emotions of these people having fun, right? But the machine view is totally different. It's actually, let me just show you the machine view briefly, so you can kind of, and hopefully you can hear a little bit of music. So this is going to be a collapse of all four of them together. So you see that the different dance forms are actually represented really differently. So there's kind of swing and salsa and West Coast swing, etc. Right? Different types of dances. I can actually highlight each one to kind of show you how the music of each one is driving the rhythm, right? But at the very end of the piece, actually, over here, I actually finally let people see what this actually is, right? So very interestingly, people see a lot of really interesting dynamics when they're forced to not see it from the human perspective. Like, for example, they'll see the little usher being picked up down on the lower right there once in a while. Right? They'll pick up this little character over here is walking around. That's because the machine doesn't care about, it just picks up something that can probabilistically picked up as a human, right? It doesn't care what you're thinking. The human actually doesn't pick up that usher or the cameraman, and so anyway, so this is really interesting difference between the way that we perceive and the way the machine perceive. But I think this artwork basically is asking us to become a machine. If you stare at these things long enough, you're going to be like, oh, okay, that's the rhythm. That's how the machine operates, right? That's all it does, actually. Then the last project I want to quickly tell you about is actually machine learning generated poetry. That's also really interesting because it gets at the heart of how we interpret machine and also human collaboration as well, right? So this is actually on a website. I can tell you that in a second. But it's also published as a book, thanks to Following Projects folks. So this one, you can probably figure out which one is human and which one is machine. I'm guessing most of you have read, you know, the William Carlos Williams poem, right? Now, if you look at the one on the right, it's picking up on this character, right? Like it's picking up on this idea well, right? Now, how do I get this like well-generated piece? I do have to curate it as well. It's not like every time it's gonna talk sensibly as well, right? So some part of the human collaboration actually happens. We actually are working on this kind of human machine text collaboration type art projects as well. Now, if you look at something more complicated, then you know, you can make a decision which one is the human versus the machine poem. None of them is the Wallace Stevens poem. So anyway, so you can get the book. We will have it ready, you know, for things like Amazon, etc. And I think you're going to have a lot of fun with looking at these machine learning generated poetry versus my own generated poetry. And maybe you're going to find that you like the machine more than me. Oh well, we'll see how it goes. So anyway, so thanks very much for listening, and especially to Neuro Design Lab and Maurice for the opportunity to actually work on some really cool, interesting, fun stuff that actually gets published into papers as well. So, and then I wanted to also let people know about our practice, our website, our studio, which is recfro at github.io, and you can check out a lot more projects actually there, and some of them are pretty recent and were just exhibited recently as well. And these are the folks that have been helping us out with the particular projects that I talked about here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you, Ray.
So this is an awkward part where I have to introduce myself because I speak next. Thank you very much for actually inviting me, Maurice. Yeah, kind of. Okay, so my name is Lisa Park, a scholar and a media artist who also dabbles with organizing art events. My art practice, events, and general life experiences drive my academic research, which is currently focused on cultural imperialism in the new media art world. My practices span across brainwave performances, academic presentations, research publication, organization of events and exhibitions, like a lot of different things. And I'm currently happy to be co-curating and producing Ars Electronica 2021 Garden Hong Kong project with Maurice. I have a BFA from New York University and MFA and a PhD from School of Creative Media. Almost, actually, I just defended just recently. So I will present my part if Charlie can project me. And this is my first panel discussion, so please, well, symposium like presentation, so please go easy on me. And I realized that I will be talking about culture, whereas everyone sort of talked about culture, but mostly there's a lot of the machinic kind of, element to it. And I will sort of change that topic slightly by looking at not human and machine interaction as much as human versus other human from different culture kind of perspective. And the whole curatorial statement of this symposium, as well as the Ars Electronica 2021, is about interfacing different cultures, different beings, different disciplines together in order to find a way out of the current situation. And right now in the environment of all the racial issues happening, I think this would be an interesting discussion. Okay. So towards ontological plurality. Okay. So we were talking about the object and subject, the artwork turning from art object to an art subject. And I would like to make a bit of a provocation. I think it's totally true. The art that was usually seen as an object, particularly in the Western mainstream worldview, has shifted considerably towards us, the subject. However, my presentation is going to be a bit of a provocation because it brings into question the very conception of what object is, what the subject is, and what the interrelationality is, which may be different from different when you see from a different ontological perspective. So, number one, multiple ontologies exist in our world, and there are fundamental disparate worldviews that developed for thousands of years in different parts, especially when the intercontinental travel wasn't possible, like it was like worlds apart. And these different worldviews, the assumptions about the world, inform the relationship between concepts such as the object and a subject. What do they mean and how do they interrelate? Mind and the body, human, non-human, and human and God or heaven, right? And one of the many differences that I want to focus on is the parsing of these different concepts. Charlie, next page, please. And so before I go ahead, I just want to like clarify like this East versus West, it just seems like a very difficult thing to handle because these are geographical markers, right? And nowadays with globalization, geographical markers are no longer demarcation of any kind of cultural, delineation, right? So I will be using the terminology of East Asia, and even East Asia is so diverse now. So I will be looking at the Confucian East, which is China, Korea, and Japan, for instance, which is what my culture is about. So I know it intimately enough to perceive it through my art practices, human relationship, etc. And then I will look at, when I refer to the Western, I sort of like dig into the Greco-Roman European lineage of thought that sort of culminates in the post-Enlightenment thought, European thought, which then culminates in modernity. And there's been a lot of books that has been published recently. Philippe Descola, for instance, who talks about ontological plurality. Yeah, that's where I take off. So if I say East, West, this is what I mean. It's a very messy kind of, it's not very easy to actually talk about these differences as if they're very, very different, but I'll get to the point, okay? So going back to the different parsing of individual concepts, there is one worldview that is focused on the essence, the salient on the actual concept itself. And there's another more holistic parsing of concept that takes place in East Asia, for instance, that's premised upon understanding that everything is constantly changing, right? So because of that complexity of temporality, which was so important from thousands of years ago, the way that one thing and another thing sort of interrelates is a big part of the whole concept itself, right? And as François Julien, a sinologist, François Julien said, one of the major differences between Eastern and Western way of thinking is the difference in absence and presence. So when absence and presence are seen as polar opposite very often in the West, absence and presence is seen as a co-constitutive whole. Like because there is absence, there can be presence, and the other way as well. It's similar to yin yang anyway. And what this kind of like very like interrelated structure, the whole focus on the context of in which everything is happening implicates the emphasis on relationality. And as such, painting was always a very relational exercise. It was a place where subjectivities would intermingle, and then the empathic connection between the scholars who are actually drawing and writing poetry together would actually be creating like a space. It was actually very interactive, and it was very much focused on like, it's like a very relational aesthetic kind of approach to making art. Like the focus was not on the making the artwork that actually hangs in the wall per se, but to the process of making it together with other scholars. That was actually seen as a very important part of art making. So if we can go to the next part. Okay, and there are other concepts that are very, very different, fundamental different, like the mind-body relationship, God-human relationship, etc. So one example I would talk about is a Taoist and Neoplatonic practices of meditation or theurgy, which is roughly contemporaneous of each other, and they were developed around 3rd or 4th century CE. And this, for the Taoists, it was through the body that the enlightenment is to be achieved. The gods were conjured into the body of the meditators, and then they were able to transcend beyond the world by, embodying the God that lives in the astral realms to come down into our body. And so the body was very important. Whereas in Neoplatonic kind of conception, the realm of the immortal was separated from the mortal, and human body required an additional mechanism of subtle body, which is a hybrid between the materiality and the spiritual aspect that was made of star fragments of ether. I think Tanya was also talking about ether. And but the body required abstinence and cleansing in order to be worthy of God. So over here you can see the way the body and the mind is configured in a hierarchical structure, or the way the God and human world is separated. Another interesting example that you can see where the vision of the body is, implicated in a different kind of way is when we go to India, which is like in between the East and the West. So you can see multiple cultures sort of colliding in that region. And the Vedic vision of body versus a tantric version, these are the two different ideas that developed, whereas the Vedas was the oldest text of Hinduism. And within it, the human body was seen to be composed of was composed of 5 layers of bodies. One is the physical body, vital breath, the mind, consciousness and intellect, and bliss. But the physical body was generally seen as an obstacle against the reunion with the Brahman, right? And then Tantra, sort of tantric kind of ideas came in, and the body was seen to offer the potentiality of yogic practices, the study of the self leading to spiritual transformation, rather than obstructing it. But what's interesting is that even though Tantra was adopted both by Hinduism and Buddhism, tantric practices lost favor with Hinduism and Indian Buddhism. Like in India, it didn't really stick. But when it went into the Tibetan Buddhism context, it became, it really picked up, and it became a highly potent spiritual practice, and it remains to this day. And this resonated, this whole emphasis on the body resonated in China, and it went into Japan, Korea. So the Buddhist kind of acceptance of the body sort of went into, well, it was much more respected. It just made more sense because of the worldview therein. And so I'm still on this slide. No, I'm still on that. And last one is looking at Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason. There were 2 modes of intuition that he spoke about. One was the phenomena, the things that were experienced through human sensory perceptions, and the noumena, things in and of themselves that lies beyond the human senses and only accessible through intellectual intuition, which only the God possesses. So there was a divide between the human and the God world over here, and also the sensory perception versus the spiritual, mental, cognitive, rational kind of way. So there was like an elevation of one over the other. And Mo Jung-san, who is a 20th century new Confucian scholar, came up and said, hey, he identified and affirmed that the transcendental distinction drawn between these 2 realms made sense even in East Asian concepts. So conceptual parallels were drawn between Neo-Confucianism and Chinese Mahayana Buddhism. But then Mo refuted that Kant's circumscription of intellectual intuition to God did not, gel well with what was, being developed in the East. Because heaven, which is like the equivalent of God in a way in the East, is immanent. It was seen to be immanent in the human mind as human beings. Heaven imparted innate moral nature. So there's other examples that I will not go into, but Neo-Confucian Luang vision also saw that the phenomena was an ordinary finite cognitive mind, but there was also infinite moral mind, and they were all kind of like co-constituted and together. They never really separated. The mind-body separation didn't really happen. And it was, it was when I speak to some of the artists, I spoke to a curator, I interviewed a curator, and for her, it was really hard to separate conscious from the subconscious, and where does that the boundary lie, right? I'm like, that's true. It's really hard to tell. And there are other philosophies that we could talk about, but I'm gonna go on to the next slide, right? Charlie. Okay, 19th century. So when there's like a fundamentally different way of actually perceiving the world, and the very fundamental basis of like seeing your own position in the world vis-a-vis other people, seeing your own position vis-a-vis other creatures, machines, etc., or God, right? When you sort of find yourself situated in a very different way of thinking about yourself, it's actually quite confusing because, like, you know, being Asian and also being brought up in an English speaking world, like for me, it's a bit of a dance, it's a struggle, identity struggle. And that's why I guess this is where my research went. So then I try to figure out, like, how does this sort of, how is this kind of issue reflected in the art world? And then I can talk about the art world imperialism. And actually it was pretty serious. So in the 19th century, there was a transposition of the Western art world to the rest of the world, and Eurocentric perspectives and conventions were sort of seen as a universal thing. You know, that was 19th century, like shortly after the whole colonial. This is when the colonial discourse, as spoken by Edward Said, for instance, was like, you know, really in force. And during this period when the academia was really building up, and the art world was really building up and sort of spreading across the world, there was the occlusion and marginalization of other views as well. And here are some references that you can look into if you like. Cultural osmosis certainly existed, like in the case of Romanticism, Japonism, chinoiserie, topiary, etc. But the integration was more superficial. It was more aesthetic integration, which led inevitably to exoticization and of the Oriental tropes and aesthetic appropriation that happened. So even though the visuals were, you know, artisty, and it's, you know, if you see something, if you like something, it's going to come out through your art practice. It's very natural. But then the problem is, even though the aesthetic crossed over, but the philosophy and the theory, that didn't cross over, because 19th century establishment of art history on art criticism, the canons, they were very Western centric. There was a difference in like the linear perspective was seen as a hallmark of modernity, right? Where one person's individual perspective, individualism, sort of determines you know, the pictorial perspective, right? That the focus on an individual's perspective versus the floating perspective, multiple perspective. And on top of that, there were institutional mechanisms of cultural imperialism, where there's tangible mechanisms, such as the network of institutions that were established across the world as the backbone of global modernization project, structures through which ideologies are transferred, embedded, and maintained, and intangible mechanisms where systems of knowledge, such as language, the logic, the processes, and the value systems that are applied as the value par excellence, are framed in a certain, you know, like worldview. And other perspectives are very often not discussed, you know, occluded from perspective. So it just, of course, it is very confusing for people trying to, you know, like try to understand curriculum from a completely different culture. And there's a lot of different questions that come up when I was reading, like Roland Barthes, for instance, like, yes, it sounds really great. It does make sense, but then there are certain things that doesn't completely make sense. I won't go into the details, but maybe later I can give some examples. You can go to the next one, please. Right. So the irreconcilable differences between East Asian and the European art world also led to two separate academic streams. So if you look at CAFA, there's a school of Chinese painting versus fine art. Like, Chinese painting is not fine art. And then there's school of Chinese painting and calligraphy versus painting. So Chinese painting is not painting. And the Department of Oriental Painting versus painting. It's like, you know, so what happens over here? And the Japanese, they took a different knack, you know, like more experience with imperialism, because, you know, they participated in some imperialist, you know, like history as well. But they sort of like segregated according to genre. So Japanese painting versus oil painting, but still a certain cultural kind of like aesthetic practice is sort of segregated and marginalized, and it becomes a thing of its own, right? And if it becomes a thing of its own that is separate from the global kind of discourse, then the discourse therein cannot really flow in. And there's a lot of different reasons, such as exoticization, the problem against the traditions. There's a lot of different issues that may come about. So what happened here is that the separation that took place at the level of institutional structure drastically curtails the likelihood for meaningful experimentation and integration of different worldview. So even though the aesthetic, the visual component may come back and forth, it's sort of like, travel across, the theories and the philosophies are locked in the specializations. So you may say that, oh yeah, we have this or that, but then the real depth of like really going in depth is really difficult to achieve because it has been sort of marginalized. And most artists want to be a global artist. You don't really want to go into a smaller field very often. That's the kind of feedback I heard speaking to some of the curators that I interviewed for my thesis as well. Okay, so here's the advocacy. I'm just going to wrap it up relatively soon. No culture is perfect. There's so many ruts in every single culture. I know so many of my own culture as well. And I'm not putting any culture above others. I don't think that should happen. And artists today and theorists and philosophers are not acting upon an intentional colonial discourse, but the ontological assumptions that underlie our creative works, therefore, are influenced by these very fundamental worldview. Therefore, we may overlook other worldview that are existing in reality. So what my advocacy is right now is for the expansion of knowledge to include alternative perspectives rather than going on with this critical activism. And in order to do so, we have to maintain a clear distance from nationalism and regionalism. So with the current discourse going on, it's not going to be like, one race against other race. It's more about continuing to start more dialogues and working together with different people from different cultures and being cautious of the activist type nuance of post-colonialism. So ever since I started doing the research, I would start seeing oh, what you said just now, that was a bit problematic. And then I'll bring this up in conversation with my friends, and suddenly the conversation will end. This kind of direct confrontation is generally not the very, very best way for you to actually come up with any kind of new ways of working and doing stuff. So yes, so the idea is to have critical discussion with workable proposal rather than simple antagonization, which is also the idea of Chen Guangxing, who believes in Asia as a method to really diversify different cultural perspectives and to sort of expand the mainstream academic discourse and the art world discourse. And it's not to, and we have to remember not to essentialize at individual levels, to say like Asians are like this and that, which I hear a lot of, a lot of, right? But to recognize that regional characteristics manifest at the broader level of society. So you can't really essentialize anybody, one person, or like a group of people a certain way, but that you can still see that there is a tendency and there's a propensity, and you can, and I think those are very interesting, because if there is any kind of cultural kind of propensities that manifest to this day, it's really resilient, and that is really fundamental. And I think those are where we can start talking about it. That's where we can start discussing and interfacing different perspectives in order to find a better way forward. So when it comes to speaking with the machines, I think I can talk about Dr. Yokui's work, where he talks about the fact that there's not only one technology. Technology in itself has many different technologies. They're also informed by what the culture sort of dictates. And he would use examples of looking at Prometheus, the creation myth. He compares it to the Chinese creation myth, and he deduces that there's a very different conception happening there. And the conceptions of art, how much criticality is prescribed to art, or the position and the role of art, all these different conceptions are very, very different. And my advocacy is for people who are from an alternative culture to really be involved in questioning the dominant paradigm of thinking and to expand that discourse. Yeah, I think that's about it. I think we're all very tired, and I think we may have about 15 minutes of discussion time left, but is Dekai here? Yes, Dekai is here. Let me introduce Dekai briefly before we start a very quick Q&A session. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A session, maybe 18 minutes. So Professor Dekai's work in AI, language, music, creativity, and ethics urges cultures to interrelate. Professor of Computer Science and Engineering at Hong Kong UST and distinguished research scholar at Berkeley's ICSI, he was named ACL Founding Fellow for pioneering contributions to machine learning of AIs like Google, Yahoo, Microsoft Translate. Dekai is also creator of one of Hong Kong's best-known world music collectives, Reorientate, and was one of the 8 inaugural members of Google's AI Ethics Council. So, Dr. Dekai.
Hi, happy to be here. This has been fascinating. Just to make sure, can everybody, is my audio coming through fine? Wonderful. So it's been a stimulating, thought-provoking, wandering journey through a lot of themes here. And, you know, I am someone who has been doing hardcore AI research for 35 plus years. My PhD thesis at Berkeley many years ago was one of the first to argue for machine learning approaches to getting AIs to understand human language. And then having been recruited straight from that among the founding faculty of Hong Kong UST, immediately turned to the problem of how do we get this brave new world of machine learning to learn how to translate between languages, because arriving in Hong Kong, the first thing you notice is this cultural barrier between the language speaking communities, and back then under the British, it was actually being used as a sort of an elite ruling class, colonial type of thing, where the non-English fluent speakers had an additional barrier to cross. You know, so it's been fascinating listening to these discussions about transduction, about, you know, for me, everything that we do is about interpretation, is about translation. And the task that we set ourselves 30 years ago of building machines that could learn to interpret some sort of input well enough to be able to then transduce it, to translate it into a different representation, a different cultural representation, that is the key to what we think of as human intelligence. That is the one thing that other species can't do. Now, as somebody who comes at this from an AI perspective, much of the discussion that I hear still seems extremely human-centric. Now, of course, that's natural. This is the art world, after all, should be humanistic. But I'm hearing, you know, from the point of view of somebody who thinks as much about the world of AIs, the environment in which artificial agents exist, what their existence is, as I think about that of humans. It seems like a bit of cultural imperialism itself, where we are anthropomorphizing many of the machines that we're building, and we're holding them to a standard that comes from our own cultural biases. Think about the reverse. I would like the speakers to think about the reverse, where instead of anthropomorphism, which is how we project human qualities or notions upon the machines that we're building, what would the reverse be? If a machine, an AI, is projecting its cultural biases and so forth upon humans, you know, maybe we should call this cybermorphism in reverse. You know, and this gets really interesting because, you know, in discussing metaphor, in discussing storytelling and narrative, and by the way, so I'm coming from a background here where my PhD at Berkeley, my advisors included George Lakoff, who pioneered, you know, the study of metaphor in cognitive linguistics, and I still work with George now, and the AI group that I came from Robert Walensky's actually was a pioneer of narrative AI, of story understanding. And so a lot of what was said resonates with me, but I think I would challenge the speakers to take it a step further. Because when we describe the things that we've been hearing about the last couple of hours, we are making up our own metaphors to talk about the machines. We are imposing our cultural biases upon the machines. And so we're telling a story from a human perspective of what the machines are doing. But that's only one of 4 possibilities, if we even just look at it simply, right? First of all, there is also the way that we tell the story of ourselves. You know, in fact, when we talk about consciousness, very much of the time, what we are doing is we are talking, it is humans telling the story of humans. It's how we narrate our own existence and thoughts to ourselves. It's the stories we tell ourselves. And from that comes our perception of awareness. What happens when we look at the other combinations of how humans are telling the stories of humans? Humans are telling the story of machines from a human perspective. What about machines telling the story of humans from the machine's perspective? And what about machines telling the story of machines from the machine's perspective? What is the place of art within that matrix? We've been speaking of art only from the first of those 4 possibilities, and perhaps the second. But is that the role of art? Should art not be looking at all 4 quadrants of this matrix in an era where consciousness today, and I'll make this argument in a bit, is actually a combination of human and machine awareness and thought and interpretation? So I would just like to throw that at the panel and see if I get any rises, any thoughts about that.
I'm fine with reacting to this. May I?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Okay, that's exactly the question on which everybody is knocking to, in a way, like you knock to the door or to the wall. I think first, as soon as we understand that the machine are created by humans, when humans and machine communicate, it's still human-to-human communication for me. That means it's already a translator. The machine, as you said, is a translator. So the translator, if you want to know what machine, what kind of point of view the machine have, this is exactly what I was talking about when I talk about power chess, or when I talk about that dialogue. This is how the machine generating kind of living entity try to perceive the humankind. But what I am insisting on is the fact that actually the machine, when they do that, they have been attributed intentionally the intentions of understanding humans. So it's still human. And is it too human? That was a question. When we consider that the evolution is made of multiple errors and accidents, and this is what humans are now, we may imagine that we produce enough human accidents in the production of machine that they would create entities that would have a huge, big amounts of variation or alterations that would make them different. So they would become something like, a kind of extension of the humankind made by accident. I love the theory, you know, that the human consciousness would come from a virus. And some people are explaining or justifying this theory that a virus would have created consciousness as a survival form of survival from a form of evolution. Now, it would be interesting to know if in 1,000 years, way beyond our time, like Tanya mentioned it, maybe we will consider that the humankind as a virus has brought consciousness to machines, and nobody will believe that. I mean, no machine will believe that at this time. And it's what I mean, and then I converge with Ray, that the narrative is still human-made. So the artificiality, as soon as we understand it's human-made, because the production of the art is what humans do, otherwise it's production of nature, it's something else. This, I think, all this enter a process of evolution, but so far, machines are just doing what we ask them to do. So their point of view is still a human point of view. Is it a too human point of view? That's what we should consider.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And what I wanted to bring out as an overall motivation for my talk is that we have a much more still a much too human-centered approach to ourselves, also to machines and to ourselves. And it's an important task is to understand at which level we actually can we actually formulate the level at which we interact with machines that does not use this traditional human-centered categories. And what can we explain visual perception in my case without of humans and machines without taking in the whole baggage of human-centeredness. I mean, that's what I tried to.
Well, let me throw something into those two thoughts there. So, you know, this notion of intentionalities. First of all, I think it's worth noticing that the notion of intentionalities is itself a metaphor, as is agency. In fact, our human languages revolve around the notion of a subject, a verb, an object, and so forth. That itself imposes a metaphor of agency on everything. And so it is almost impossible for us to even talk about this as we're using language without imposing that human-centered metaphor of agency and therefore intentionality. What is intentionality if we take away those human biases and we look at the machines? Is it correct for us to be making a separation between what nature does and the artificial? It is quite arguable, and I have argued, that the notion of artificial is itself artificial.
No, because etymologically, sorry.
Can I just quickly come in? I don't think that the notion of intentionality is irrevocably belonging to typical humanistic basis. I mean, you have a biological notion of intentionality that does not inherit the kind of bias we are questioning.
Well, there are two different things going on here. Of course, you have other species that are goal-directed in their behavior. But the question is, number one, how aware are they of their being goal-directed? How much reasoning are they doing about it? And then the second aspect of this, which is really what I was alluding to, is we are the ones who are imposing this notion of intentionality upon that behavior.
Oh,
I
yeah, I would
have
like to
some
reply to
people-
that because, oh, sorry, Martin, go. I will speak after.
Okay, there's a number of issues here that that I would like to bring to bear on these points. First of all, one could conceive of an opposition between the human and artificial intelligence, and that there is a privileging of the human over AI. But one could reconfigure that opposition into living and non-living systems. And the role of intentionality can be brought to bear here on shifting the opposition to living and non-living, between organic, emergent behavior and the behavior of the logic of machinery. Take, for example, the difference between an orchestra and a jazz ensemble. So an orchestra involves the executive function of a conductor, which exerts operational control over the interpretation of a given score, which is like a program. But with the jazz ensemble, what we have is the emergence of properties which take place in a form of embodied as well as distributed cognition, which involves multiple timescales existing simultaneously. So that jazz ensemble members can bring, for example, the song form like a score and keep the presence of that score in mind, which can only take place at very slow cognitive speeds, while at the same time they have to interact, and this is part of the research that I'm doing, interact with the other jazz musicians at very fast speeds, where they are, in a sense, reacting at such speeds that it's occurring beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. So the question of intentionality is actually quite to the point here, with respect to the emergence of sonic behavior in a jazz ensemble.
Yeah, so thank you. Martin, I think that this is actually, you're helping us get to the point that I'm actually trying to make, right? So we built actually, earlier we were hearing about poetry generation. Actually, my group built the first world, rap battle bot that learned to freestyle against people by themselves, which is, computational creativity halfway between our work in music AI and language AI.
Which is really cool from my perspective.
Massively improvisational, right? And this was like 6 years ago, something like one International Computer Music Conference Best Presentation Award. And so here's the thing about intentionality. As you've just moved us toward, we have in our mental processes, broadly speaking, the 95% of mental processes below the level of consciousness. They're automatic processes. Danny Kahneman likes to call them system 1, etc. And then we have a tiny fraction of our mental processes, which is this slow, conscious reasoning, the rationality that we are aware of because we are telling ourselves the story of our thinking. And so when we talk about intentionality, here's the crux. Most of what we do because we feel like doing it. That is the automatic, unconscious system 1 type processing. And actually fairly small amounts have to do with our conscious system 2, slow, reasoned processing, right? And so intentionality is used generally by people without making that distinction. And generally a lot of intentionality comes from the unconscious processing, not the conscious processing from the Turing and von Neumann kind of model of AI.
Exactly right. If I could just create a parenthesis here, in jazz improvisational pedagogy, the distinction is made between, for example, Charlie Parker says, first learn everything you can about music and then forget everything and just play, which involves bringing what one learns at slow speeds in the practice room to bear on and superimposing that on the bandstand, versus what Sonny Rollins says is that don't play the music, man, just let the music play you, where you get the sense of this very fast reactive form of cognition points towards a form of distributed emergent behavior that becomes parallel prost and involves feedback loops that are beyond the conscious control of the players.
Exactly. And so this is why I'm not convinced entirely by this distinction between living and non-living systems, or between carbon and silicon-based systems, because since most of intentionality, as a musician myself, so I went through the same process with my jazz teachers, subverting what the classical, European symphonic tradition we're trying to teach. Most of intentionality is actually below the level of consciousness. And so rather than taking a carbon supremacist point of view, why not acknowledge that most of intentionality is happening below the level of, it's really pattern recognition, pattern association, automatic transduction, rather than a human privilege.
And what I'm
sorry, Dekai, but I think I have to reply to that, because I proposed the title "Artificial Intentionality" as the title of the Hong Kong Garden for Ars Electronica. So I have to explain what I mean exactly by that, because when you say that the intentionality is usually something unconscious for the living beings, and of course, for the machine as well, it's unconscious, because it has been designed for them. And what I'm talking about is when you introduce in the machine intentions, for me, it's related with the will of meaning something, the building of meaning. So we are not talking about the same thing, I think, at all. The question is not if I cannot put in the same basket the animals, for example, not human, and the machine, not human. They are not the same. Animals have plenty of intentions. But for example, all animal intentions related to survival don't exist in machine. Machines don't care about survival. So, except if we program them for that. So human give machine the will to survive or not. So this intention of surviving is something which is human-made. So when you say artificial is something built by human, yes, definitely. Nature has been built by humans, not the nature, the concept of nature. The concept of nature is human. That means it's something which is outside the human control. That's nature. And nature has been built, the concept of nature has been built by human. So the concept of artificiality that is related to the Greek with techne, with the both meanings of technology, technique, and art, artifact. The artifact is made by human. This is a fact of the art. And this is something clearly defined as such. So we, of course, make.
Maurice, you went on mute somehow.
Sorry, you didn't get my thing?
It just happened about 5 seconds ago.
Okay, so what I mean, when you talk about metaphoric use of the term, you are using artificiality or intentionality in a metaphorical level. I think what we mention when we say that is the difference between a machine that executes very simple task that is supposed to be purely functional and some other designed to execute meaningful tasks. Meaningful, I mean meaningful for humans, because I'm talking about artists making artworks. And so you can tell me, oh yeah, so this is a human point of view, but I can discuss the point of view of the stones, and I have no idea, and actually, I don't care. What is the point of view of the stone? I really don't care, but I'm interested if you have something about that. But when we talk about intentionality, we talk about the building of meanings through action. And so this is something that determines what humans do when they make art using what we call the art subject. So I think the problem is not that we disagree on the term, we disagree on the meaning, but we may disagree on the use of the term. Because when I talk about intentionality, I'm not talking about unconscious intentionality, which also applies to machine as soon as they have been designed for that. So I cannot say they are conscious. It's something else.
So very interesting. I mean, Maurice, as you know, I'm someone who's spent my entire life studying what meaning is. And so when we built the first Google Translate type system 30 years ago almost, it had very little, grasp of meaning. It was sort of word correspondences between English and Chinese. And as we continued, we looked increasingly at how do you deepen the level of understanding. But then you start running into the age-old philosophical questions of what is meaning? What is it for a machine or a human to actually grasp the meaning of subjects? And then you get into the whole discussions alluded to by several people in this session with Wittgenstein's approach, which generally makes sense, more hermeneutic approach, meaning being the use of things. But that is something that non-human species can do as well, and machines can do as well, if you just say meaning is use. And we've already seen, even between humans, as Lisa was talking about, the way we conceptualize use varies hugely between a Chinese speaker versus an English speaker versus an Arabic speaker, and so on. And so there's not necessarily any privilege for one particular culture's notion of the right language in which use is couched, is framed. And a machine's representation or language of its existence, of its environment, may also quite well be implementing Wittgenstein. It doesn't necessarily have to be in English or Chinese. Internally, what's going on?
I'm French, so I'm not receptive to this discussion. Because you talk about privilege, there is a big difference between privilege and point of view. So where are you located? Where are you situated when you consider something? And I have the feeling that whatever we say or we think, it's situated as a human thinking about the world. Whatever we say, we can, even if we say, oh, I want to think, and this is what the whole event is supposed to be about. If I project myself into a robot, if I project myself into a network, if I project myself into a generated entity, it's still projecting myself. And so this is one of the things, and it's not a privilege. It's just because we are human, and I would be a fox, a rabbit, or a virus, I would do the same, exactly the same.
So I like using the word privilege because it is a little bit provocative and it's creating a particular narrative.
But it's a cliche,
so here's the thing. It helps us to understand that in an age where our consciousness, our thinking is already beginning to merge with AIs. A bunch of my brain that used to be just my own brain is actually now in my AI. So like on my phone is a bunch of my memory and spatial orientation and so forth already.
I totally agree on that.
This is going to integrate more and more, right? And so as this rapidly happens and our awareness starts becoming a combination of what's in our neurobiological processing and the artificial AI processing, where does intentionality end? Where is the beginning and ending of human and artificial intentionality?
Yeah, I think we are not using the terms the same way. That's the point. You know, when I say you can have a very very advanced car with a lot of function in the car is one thing, and the car does mechanically many or electronically many things that with a very clear purpose, and we could define that and we can put figures on it. But as soon as you're facing an artwork, there is something else. So where we have to draw the line.
A good example. Like a better example of what I'm talking about would be the way that AIs today are deciding what information enters our consciousness, enters our brains. Right. This is already happening with social media recommendation engines, search engines, Amazon recommendation engines, and so forth. Machines today are already deciding what your attention gets drawn to and what your attention does not get drawn to. And so as that integrates more and more, with smart glasses and with contact lenses and so forth, where the AIs are deciding what you see, what you hear. And by definition, therefore, deciding what you don't see and what you don't hear, because none of us has enough attention to be aware of everything that's happening in the world all at once. And so therefore, there is a direct impact upon your intentionality, because attention has a lot to do with intentionality. And machines today are already driving your attention.
I agree with that. We don't. I think we are talking.
I see Beatrice unmuting herself.
No, I'm not muted. I'm not muted.
I mean, it's like really intentionality covers. In good old philosophical tradition, you have intentionality with a T and intentionality with an S, right? We former professional philosophers know that. So it's a little bit difficult to see what you guys are talking about in this intentionality debate.
Because we are not talking about.
Absolutely agree, and that's a point I think both of you you have to disconnect intentionality from consciousness. I mean, we agree. I mean, that's step one, right? But that doesn't mean that we're talking about the same thing still. Right? So.
Yeah, I think it's not. When we seem to disagree, it's just because we are not talking about the same thing. I'm thinking about when you design an artwork, for example, the one you see in the back here, where you see actually they are playing chess with wine corks, the corks of bottle of wines, which is preparing the party on Sunday. And so, they didn't ask me to do that. They didn't want to do it. They don't care about chess. They just, it's just something we design with an intention of meaning something. And so when I say the robots are actually trying to understand human conflicts, it's purely metaphorical, of course, definitely, because we designed them to do that. So it's artificial intention, because even the intention has been artificially built. None of them said, oh, I would like to talk about human conflicts. They don't care. They don't care. But we design these conflicts as an artistic discourse. And this is why we are not talking about the same thing. I know. Let me
throw something back at you.
Yeah.
So in modern every form of modern AI since the time the back at the time when we pushed machine learning into AI, every AI is driven by an objective function, which is just some way of specifying what is the objective. Now, of course, if one takes a simplistic view and says, this is just a dumb machine and it's going to optimize whatever parameters it has to maximize that objective function. And then you imagine some relatively stupid regression model to do that, then you can argue that is at a level that doesn't approach human levels of meaning. On the other hand, with the more sophisticated types of AI that we are actually building, there are many layers. There are many different modules, and in pursuit of whatever you define as the ultimate objective function, which is survival in its environment, which is, you know, being the fittest in its environment and therefore ensuring survival. In the process of optimizing that, the AI has to learn various representations, learn various different types of predictions, sub-predictions. And in doing so has you know, higher level objective functions as well that emerge from the lower ones. And that becomes something which is much more human-like. Now, we don't program those. This is not the old days. This is not the old days.
It's not even a metaphor, it's an analogy. It's an analog of human life. So what we describe is exactly what I call artificial intentionality. This is it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So we agree on that. It's not a defect. It's just a fact. It's human design, and this is why the concept may be interesting, is to say that artificial intelligence without artificial intentionality doesn't make any sense. It's just
the
capacity of computing.
So would you agree with this, is that it's less and less by human design?
It will be less and less,
more and more evolving by itself.
It may happen.
What it does.
It may happen like the virus. Like the virus, you know the theory of the virus at the origin of consciousness? It's really interesting because this is something, you know, this is related to the idea that the DNA evolution is determined by things, maybe also by viruses that get integrated into the DNA and that affect in a way based on the model of transmission of information, circulation, survival, and so on. Then we forgot about them. They don't exist anymore, but they are us. And I totally believe that this makes sense. This makes sense in the long run, and totally. But this is, you understand, when we talk about artificial intentionality, we talk about now, where we are, where we go, and how artists can deal with machines to talk about things that make sense for human.
Absolutely. I keep getting these messages. Yeah. Yes. I'm sorry. Who's speaking?
Let me just mention one thing.
Oh, hi.
When you were describing simpler and lower order computational processes generating more complex cognitive processes, so that lower order emerges into higher order functioning. And you said that it suggests that these technologies seem to make them more human. What I would suggest, you don't even need the word human there. What you're describing is that artificial intelligence,
I agree, yes,
is obeying the laws of emergence which govern all living systems.
I agree. I actually said more similar to what humans do. I absolutely don't think it needs to be human.
Yeah,
why
right.
do you add? Why do you?
This is why.
What allows you to add that it's more similar to humans? I mean, that I
no in the level of complexity, because one thing that you know, like constant annoyance to us in AI is that people oversimplify what AI is. You know, first they constantly get stuck in the good old-fashioned AI trap of thinking humans are programming them the way we're programming by logic, other traditional software. But more recently, as people have learned a little bit about machine learning, then they oversimplify and they think that the objective function in some sort of relatively flat glorified regression model is all there is. And so what I'm doing is I'm pushing back against that and pointing out that real AI research is a much more complex hierarchy of layers of objective functions that emerge, and that level of complexity is more similar to the level of complexity we see in humans.
Which is why
I absolutely agree with.
If I could just interrupt for a second, if I'm pushing back at the notion that this is necessarily an anthropocentric perspective, more a perspective that's focusing on how living systems actually work. And if one reifies anything, it's reifying not the human, but living systems. Sorry to interrupt.
Absolutely. You know, I keep seeing these messages from our poor organizers saying that we are massively over time. I do want to,
Yes.
but I do want to make sure that Beatrice, that you have a chance to say what you want to say, and any of the other panelists as well.
So I can very, very briefly. I mean, I completely agree with you up to a point where you then conclude from that it makes the sophisticated AI machine more and more like humans, and that I don't follow your reasoning.
No, I said more like the complexity level of humans.
Yeah, but I mean, that's where I get lost.
There's a big difference, because you have complex systems. Okay. So you are familiar with complex systems, complex dynamic systems.
Sure.
So you can have systems that are at different levels of complexity. I don't want to get too technical. All right. My objection to a lot of what people mischaracterize AI as is that many people think that they're very simple systems.
Yeah, but let's not talk about people's misconceptions of contemporary AI. I mean,
yeah, but I don't want to be misquoted here. I did not say that the emergence of these higher level objectives necessarily leads to a human-like organization. Certainly doesn't. Okay. What I was saying was the level of complexity is more similar to that of human intelligence.
Yeah,
big difference.
May I add something which is very important because it's related to the event? Because, you know, there are different, not only different level of complexity, but different kind of complexity. So the question is, and you know, it's an important one because we're gonna talk about it on Sunday, is can AI get drunk?
Absolutely. We are going to talk about that on Sunday with Professor
you see.
Ken Ueno. And I hope we will all do so from a very drunken standpoint.
I'm sure.
Very much looking forward to that. But I do want to thank the speakers very much for this. Hopefully we managed to wake up the conversation after hours of talks at this late hour in Hong Kong, and really appreciate the good humor with which the panel has been taking the provocations, somewhat intentional provocations.
But not artificial.
Very natural. Very much look forward to further conversations offline and hopefully in person at some point. And thank you so much to our distinguished speakers. Very provocative series of talks. Let me turn it back over to Lisa or Maurice.
I think it'll be Maurice. Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Maurice, do you want to close the event?
Yeah, just a few words. I was impressed to see, you know, I just checked the number of people that stayed with us, and it was very stable. That's amazing, because for 2 hours and a half, something like that, we had the same number of people. So, wow, maybe they switched, they were newcomers and some gone. Because also of the clock, we are now half an hour past midnight in Hong Kong. So I can understand that suddenly figures go down. But because I think we discuss things that really makes sense. I don't say that we are right, but we are in the right debate, the right discussion. And because this is what we have to think about. And in terms of artistic practice, I think it's very important to consider all the challenges that we are facing now. I'm just a bit, I would have loved to pick one or two questions from people online, because I think it's not fair. We didn't try to react to what they say. So I don't know, can you pick one or two? Lisa, did you?
There are quite a few. I think
Yeah,
if anybody wants to answer anything in particular. Zhang Tianyi asked a question for Prof. Kai. What do you think about we as human are actually limiting the development of machine by human social value, rules, and mindset? I think there's this fear of AIs, right? Like it's so widely spread. Are we hampering their development?
Well,
No.
we very much are. So as you know, I work heavily in the AI ethics and society and governance community worldwide. A lot of the think tanks. Most of the dialogue is actually precisely about how to do that. There's very little questioning about whether we should do that. I would say, well over 95% of the people who end up in those communities come in with the a priori assumption that we should be doing that. So we would have to have an entire other panel to discuss, should we actually be doing that? It's a very good question.
I have a follow-up question, but from Maria Nathalie Panastos. Could something like that be possible? Isn't it ambitious to try to reach non-human creations, interpretation, behaving as we are linked and are humans, so we cannot leave behind our own nature? Even what machines could do and produce and interpret would have a format and medium that, as made by humans, is always dependent on that initial creator mind that is our own human one. Maybe the best way to expand our human nature and furthermore our creations and consciousness could be changing that exactly obsolete humanness.
I personally believe this is already happening. I already think that what humans think about, what our attention is on, what we're conscious of, and therefore what we end up creating as our own intentions, is already heavily a product of AI thinking and not just human thinking. And we're not even aware of it because we're not aware of what we don't get shown by Facebook or Twitter or Google. And so because of that, we are already in a situation where the environment in which we are evolving is being co-created by humans and machines. And machines are much more influential already in that co-creation than we give credit for.
Right. If I may just add one more thing, we talked about intentionality a lot, but I do wonder if next time we can talk about unintentionality, right? Because like we're
excellent.
so focused on this like intentional direction towards something that we intend, but then that's where humanness is, right? This whole very aggressive like direction to intend something, to want to do something and pursue that thing. It's a very human aspect. I mean, I think all animals
only when they
way.
are too human.
So,
only when they are too human. Too human means investing too much of the weakness of the humankind. And this is what creates a distortion that makes people scared by machine. They're just saying, oh, they're too human. They will do exactly what the bad people do.
yeah.
I think Maria has her hands up, by the way.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Can you unmute yourself, Maria? Can we unmute Maria, Charlie? Yes, good. Please go ahead, Maria. Ms. Panatsos? Don't hear anything.
No, I don't.
Yeah, I think maybe some technical.
I guess I wanted to say something before you guys wrap up.
Yeah. Do it.
Yeah, super fascinating discussion. I think I'm in a unique position where I did neuroscience and kind of human-computer interaction area. So I kind of look at it both from the machine's perspective and from the human's perspective. If you do that fight, I think what I am kind of being on the side on is that actually the humans are making all this up. Even the part where machines are getting smarter and smarter, and that part of it even is because we have a story about them getting smarter and smarter. But but the actual machine themselves are this code that we don't quite understand. So that's kind of like where I'm standing, just from both the neuroscience side and the kind of slightly computer science-y side.
But this is projecting intention of that kind on the machine is anthropomorphism. It's just to say that suddenly the machine would like to, not sure they want. So the thing that I'm still in that, machine want what they tell them to want. When we tell them to want, that's the point. Okay, so anyway, we have to decide of a time when this thing will stop. I'm sure we'll find a good opportunity to make a publication out of it, out of the discussion, out of the written lectures that has been proposed, and we are the core of the topics that make us think about the present of art, not the future. This is where we are. We have to think about that.
Right.
Each of you want to say a conclusive sentence? I wouldn't like to be the one who would just end.
Okay, I'll do one. So if it's hard to get to know what the machine wants because we can't really see what they want, then maybe we can start with other cultures first. That's my comment. Anyone else?
I would second that. Understanding other cultures and understanding how different they are is an excellent exercise to understand how AIs are.
Yeah.
A question will be, have AI, do they have cultures? Do they have a culture?
Oh, absolutely.
So the definition of culture will be, will have to be discussed.
Yes, but
I mean,
it's so obvious that when you have the same machine learning model, but it's embedded within the US, like Microsoft Tay, that old example, versus the same software machine learning in China becoming branded as Xiaoice. They're, Tay becomes offensive and racist within 24 hours each time. And Xiaoice becomes one of the best chatbots in the world.
Become more and more humanized each time. It's quite amazing. Anthropomorphism is not as a bad word, like I think in a worldview where the distinction between the human and the non-human is not necessarily so segregated, just adding to that. So there's more, I think, more affinity towards the non-human that can be seen, that animism, etc., is not necessarily a bad thing versus, Okay. All right, Ray, more? Yeah, I think we're tired. It's 12:40. This is an excellent conversation that just went on forever. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for your contribution. That was really fascinating. And I think it was dense and intense as well, which is slightly different. Sometimes like that, but just a bit.
Yeah, we should do it earlier next time.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm really tired, and I think I'm not the only one. Here it's now close to 1 a.m. and I look fresh as somebody around 1 a.m. that woke up at 5 a.m. So I thank you, all of you, for your contribution. This was, as I say, good and intense, and I hope there is a future to this discussion.
Sunday.
Of course, but at this time, this is the invisible clock. I'm using the invisible clock. You too.
Blurry. Cheers to everyone. Thank you very much for your time. Look, where's your mezcal?
And if you come in, and if you come online or on site on Sunday at 12 CET or 6 Hong Kong time, you will see also the power chess robot in action, and probably not with wine corks, but this will come. And I saw during the talk, listening to Martin, I thought I should call this work cork openings. Bye.